I was halfway up a dead mountain road, with sleet needling the windshield, when I decided this job was either going to make my quarter or get me buried in snow beside a very expensive mistake. The estate sat above the tree line, like it had grown out of the rock itself, a heavy collision of stone, iron, and old blood. It was the kind of place that keeps its heat in the walls and its secrets under the floorboards. And I was there for one reason. A remote lichen pack was bleeding resources so fast the numbers looked less like bad management and more like a staged collapse. I'm a forensic auditor trained in architecture, which means I don't just see bad books. I see stress loads and the cracks people paint over because they think no one smart enough will ever look up. So that was the situation. I had a mountain estate under a storm warning, a pack on edge, and staff who kept their eyes down just a little too fast. At the center of it all was Thiago, a pack leader who was far too calm for a man losing money by the hour. He wasn't charming, which would have been easy, but instead he was huge and quiet, with a weariness that made every movement feel expensive. The air around him had that raw alpha vibration, a mix of deep cedar and cold rain, and the restrained force of his presence vibrated in my chest before he even spoke. I clocked him the same way I clocked the estate, seeing a load-bearing structure that was starting to crack. What I wanted should have been simple. I planned to finish the audit, find the leak, get paid, and leave. I didn't come there to get tangled up in pack politics or old family rot. And I certainly didn't plan on the heat that hit every time Thiago stepped too close in a cold room. My goal was to walk into a powerful space, ignore the performance, and follow the numbers until they started telling the truth. I wanted my fee in full and my reputation sharper than when I arrived. But honestly, that last part started slipping way too early. The problems were everywhere once I started looking. The books were wrong in a curated way, with supplies billed but never used, and fuel purchased that was never burned. Vendor codes looped through old tunnel access under the estate, and whole wings of the house were sealed off while heat bled through the stone like the building was trying to warn me. Then there was Jaden, the security chief, who was smooth in that polished way men get when they think control is the same thing as competence. He answered too fast and watched too hard, and when a blizzard took out the bridge and trapped me on the estate, the conflict stopped being about money and became about power and hunger. Then the shift came. It didn't happen in the ledgers, but at breakfast in a quiet kitchen while the boiler hissed and the storm beat at the windows. He was drinking coffee black enough to strip paint, and I told him it was too bitter, because no one else in that house had the nerve to tell him the truth. Before I could move, he stepped in with all that corded strength and heat to press the mug against my lips. "Sweeten it," he said, his voice low and rough, and that was the moment everything tilted. It wasn't just because it was almost a kiss, but because it was a challenge and a line crossed in plain sight. By the end, the theft ring would be exposed and the old crimes dragged into the light, and the mountain estate would still be standing because I refused to let it fall. But the world wouldn't go back to how it was for either of us. You can audit a house, fix a system, or even save a pack from itself. But you can't step that close to fire and pretend your skin didn't change. I should have known the mountain wanted blood before it gave up answers. By the time I reached the estate, sleet was skating sideways across the windshield, and the road behind me was already turning white. A gate of black iron opened before I even touched the horn, which felt like they'd been waiting for me. It seemed like someone inside knew exactly when I'd arrive, and exactly why. And that was my first real problem. The second problem was the staff. Not one of them looked surprised to see me, but they all looked braced for something. I got out with my case files under one arm and the cold needling through my coat, and the house hit me all at once with the scent of wet stone and banked heat. It sat on the mountain like some huge animal keeping still on purpose, and while it was beautiful, it also felt fundamentally wrong. I've worked enough high-value audits to know the feel of a place where money is being hidden, but this felt like the books were only the skin over something much meaner. Then I met Thiago. He was standing in the main hall with one hand in his pocket and exhaustion pulled tight across his face, looking like sleep had been losing to duty for weeks. He possessed a terrifying, enticing density of muscle that made the room recalculate around him. His dark shirt had the sleeves rolled up to show forearms roped with corded strength. But that wasn't the thing that really got me. It was the stillness. Because everyone else in that house moved around him, while he didn't move for anyone. "You have 7 days," he said. He didn't offer a hello or a welcome. He just gave me the terms. So I looked him dead in the face, set my bag down on his polished stone floor, and told him that if his numbers were as bad as the brief suggested, 7 days would only get him a triage report. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy and thick blanket that seemed to swallow the room. One of the staff near the stairs actually stopped breathing for a second, and I mean that literally. Thiago's gaze dropped to my case files before coming back to me. His eyes were dark gold in the low light, sharp and completely unreadable, and he noted that I speak plainly. "I bill for it," I replied, and a corner of his mouth twitched in a way that was almost a smile. Then the air shifted. A gust hit the tall windows hard enough to rattle the panes, and somewhere deep in the house, I heard the metal groan. It wasn't loud, but my architect brain caught it and marked it as a load transfer or a hidden stress. My pulse kicked once because I knew that sound, and I knew that buildings make tells before they fail. So do power systems, and so do men. Thiago, standing right there in front of me, felt like all three at once. He told a member of the staff to take me to a room in his wing because the storm was moving faster than the forecast. I said I didn't need special treatment, but he told me it wasn't about that. It was about containment. "From what?" I asked. His eyes held mine just a beat too long before he told me that was exactly what he hired me to find. So that was the real question sitting under the whole frozen mountain. It wasn't just about who was stealing from the pack or why the ledgers bled in such neat, careful lines. The real question was bigger, and it had teeth. I had to wonder if I could expose what was draining Thiago's estate before the lockdown and the man himself pulled me too far in to leave clean. The woman who took my bag handled it with both hands, acting like the files inside might actually bite her. She looked to be about 50, with silver hair at her temples and that perfect stiff posture you only see in professional staff. But I could smell the sharp edge of nerves cutting through her scent of starch and soap. "This way, Miss Victoria," she said, her voice tight and formal. I almost told her to just call me Victoria, but I decided to let it go since there was no point fighting over titles in a house built on a rigid hierarchy. We crossed the main hall, where my boots clicked against black stone, polished so smooth it reflected the chandelier light in dull, golden pools. The estate was old, but clearly well-maintained and reinforced, which told me a massive amount of money had been poured into these walls over the years. That realization made the emergency brief feel much worse, because if a house this expensive was bleeding cash, someone was either incredibly stupid or acting with a very specific purpose. As we passed beneath the central arch, I looked up to inspect the load-bearing columns in the original granite. Someone had added iron braces later on, and while the work was done well, the ceiling vault remained untouched. Right at the seam where the west corridor split off, I spotted a hairline crack that had been filled and painted over in a hurry. It wasn't a structural failure quite yet, but it was a clear sign of pressure where the weight had shifted, and someone hoped a fresh coat of paint would hide the truth. It was the same story I'd seen in every bad audit I'd ever handled, and the woman noticed me staring at the ceiling. "The storm makes the house complain," she remarked, trying to offer a simple explanation for the noise. "No," I told her flatly. "Bad retrofits are what make a house complain." Her mouth tightened at my response, and she started walking a little faster, so I made sure to file that reaction away for later. We climbed a broad staircase that curved like it belonged in a cathedral, and the higher we got, the warmer the air became. It wasn't a cozy kind of heat, but a managed one, with the boiler pushing hard against the cold air bleeding through the old stone walls. I could feel the vibration in the walls, and knew whoever ran the utilities here was overcompensating for a problem somewhere else in the system. At the landing, 2 men stood near a long window, while the mountain turned white with snow behind them. I recognized one of them instantly, even though we had never actually met. It was Jaden. You can tell a lot about a man by how he carries himself when he's standing still. And while Thiago's presence felt heavy, Jaden's felt polished. He was in his mid-30s, with a neat, dark coat and not a single hair out of place. And his shoulders were set, like he was constantly aware that someone was watching him. He smiled the second our eyes met, but the expression didn't feel right. "Victoria," he said, his voice as easy and practiced as a handshake. "That was a long drive." "Remote clients usually require one," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. His gaze dipped down to my files before returning to my face, and he noted that Thiago said I could see patterns other people usually miss. I told him I only see them when they're actually there, and while his smile stayed put, his eyes turned noticeably colder. That was all the information I needed from him for now. The staff woman opened a door at the end of the hall and stepped aside to let me in. "Your room," she announced. The space was large enough to make a luxury city apartment look small, filled with dark wood, a slate fireplace, and thick rugs. It was beautiful if you didn't mind your comfort coming with a side of constant surveillance. One interior wall was lined with built-in shelves, and through a locked door on the far side, I could hear the low, rhythmic murmur of men talking. Then, one specific voice cut through all the others. It was Thiago. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was deep and controlled, the kind of voice that naturally made a room line itself up. "Your office has been prepared right through there," the woman said, pointing toward a writing desk near the fire. She also mentioned that my room was directly adjacent to the pack leader's private library. Of course it was. I set my files down on the desk and turned back to her, remarking that he certainly keeps his contractors close. She hesitated for a second before telling me that he keeps his risks even closer. Then she left me alone, with the sound of the storm tapping against the glass and the heavy, locked warmth of the room closing in around me. I walked the perimeter of the room out of habit, checking the window latches, the wall seams, and the vent placements. I found one secondary exit through a sitting room that opened right back into the hall I'd just come from. This wasn't about hospitality. It was about maintaining control through comfort. And while it was irritating, I had to admit it was smart. I had just pulled off my coat when I heard footsteps stop right outside my door. They weren't rushed or loud, but they were certain. And for some reason, my pulse kicked as if the real job had finally started. The door swung open before I even had a chance to touch the handle. Thiago filled the frame so completely that the room suddenly felt smaller, hotter, and much less like my own private space. He had taken off his heavy coat, leaving him in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. There was no tie and no wasted motion as he stood there, and the scent of him hit me much harder than before. He smelled like cold rain caught in wool, cedar wood, and the smoke from a fire that had burned down low. It was a clean, masculine scent that was honestly a bit distracting. He didn't look at me at first, instead performing a quick security sweep of the desk, the windows, and the exit points. Once he was satisfied, his eyes finally settled on my face. "The bridge washed out 20 minutes ago," he said, his voice steady. "You're staying here until this storm clears." "Well, that doesn't sound ominous at all," I replied. "It isn't meant to be," he said, and the way he said it almost made me laugh. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and the air in the room shifted as his body heat moved closer. He told me there were rules I had to follow, and I told him I expected as much. His gaze flicked toward the crackling fire for a moment, before he looked back at me to lay out the terms. He told me I wasn't allowed in the East Archive alone, I couldn't speak to the armed guards without clearance, and I wasn't to touch any sealed records or family holdings without him being present. I folded my arms and asked if he always greeted his consultants with a list of threats. He told me he greets people based on the level of risk they represent. When I asked if I was risking his privacy or his potential fraud, the silence in the room tightened. It wasn't a dramatic pause, just a heavy, dense feeling in the air. He took a step toward me, coming close enough that the lamplight caught the dark gold in his eyes. He explained that his pack was under immense pressure. Resources were missing, and the weather was cutting them off from the world, so he wasn't in the mood to worry about whether his boundaries seemed rude. That was fair, and I hated the fact that I agreed with him. Outside, a sudden gust of wind hit the windows with a hard sweep that made the glass shiver in the frames. Deep inside the walls, I heard that same low groan of metal I'd noticed downstairs, and my attention snapped toward the sound immediately. Thiago noticed my reaction and asked if I had heard that noise before. I told him I had, and when he asked what it was, I looked up at the ceiling and let my architect brain process the data. I explained that it was a stress transfer, likely caused by the boiler overcompensating or an added load path that shouldn't be carrying that much weight. Either way, I told him his house was working far too hard. His jaw flexed at that, but buildings don't care about a man's pride, and neither do the numbers on a ledger. I was about to tell him exactly that, but he spoke up first, informing me that I would have access to the household ledgers and supply contracts tonight. I told him that didn't feel like trust, and he countered by saying it was just efficient enough to be useful. I felt a small, sharp pulse of respect for him before I could stop myself. Then the atmosphere changed again, and this time it wasn't just a feeling. A bell rang once down the corridor with a short, urgent sound that made Thiago turn his head toward the door. Every line of his body changed in an instant, and he didn't just look bigger, he looked dangerous. He was packed tight like a spring pulled to its absolute limit, looking every bit the pack leader, and nothing like a man who could be reasoned with. He went to the door and opened it to find a young guard standing there, looking like he was trying very hard not to panic. The guard reported that the lower pass was gone, and the radio tower had iced over, which meant Jaden was currently locking down all the outer routes. Thiago nodded and ordered a full estate protocol, and the guard glanced at me briefly before looking away and confirming the order. When the door shut again, the room felt even smaller than it had before. I let out a slow breath and realized we were in a full lockdown, which meant I wasn't just temporary help anymore. Thiago's eyes came back to mine, steady and impossible to read. He told me that if someone was bleeding the estate dry from the inside, they now knew I was trapped here with them. That realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. For a long beat, neither of us moved, while the fire snapped in the grate and the storm pressed against the glass. Through the wall behind him, I could feel the faint vibration of voices gathering in the next room, speaking fast and low. I lifted my chin and told him I was going to need more than just selective paperwork to get this done. His mouth twitched into that same almost smile that felt like it had teeth behind it. He told me I would get results instead of comfort, and I told him that was fine by me, because I never trust comfort in a house that is already on fire. For the first time since I arrived, he looked at me like he actually believed I might be useful. The ledgers showed up in 2 locked archive boxes, delivered by a footman whose expression suggested I should feel honored by the task. I didn't feel honored. I felt suspicious. I spread the contents across the desk, organizing everything by category to get a clear view of the mess. Household food orders sat in one pile, followed by heating fuel, guard payroll, contractor invoices, and emergency storm stock. It was my version of triage, consisting of clean stacks and a sharpened pencil, while my tea went cold beside me. People in financial distress never seem to understand that numbers rot faster when you keep interrupting the person trying to fix them. At first glance, the books almost looked functional. That was the real problem. The columns were neat and the signatures matched, while the monthly swings looked seasonal enough to pass a lazy review. But lazy reviews are for men who prefer summaries, and I prefer finding the stress points. I stopped reading the top lines and started cross-checking the volume of goods against their actual use. Food imports were too high for the resident count by almost 18%. The heating fuel situation was even worse. The estate was buying enough reserve oil and treated coal to heat 2 additional wings at full winter load. But 2 wings were sealed, and one of them wasn't even occupied. I'd felt the warmth imbalance in the walls on my way up the stairs, and now I had the hard numbers to match the draft in my spine. I started making notes as fast as I could. Guard contracts showed massive overtime during the storm months, which would usually make sense if the patrol routes got harder to navigate. However, the route lengths listed on the sheets didn't change at all, meaning they were billing higher for the same maps and the same head count. These were cleaner lies than most, but they were still lies. Then I hit the vendor codes. There it was, repeating every 6 weeks under different invoice language that covered everything from salt and boiler clamps to medical linen and root vegetables. On the surface, it looked harmless because it shared the same approval chain and transport class. But when I looked closer, I saw different supplier names, all tied to one buried code cluster. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the page. Cute, I muttered. Because it was cute, and while it was annoying, it was also smart. If you inflate the cost of basic goods and move them under weather-disrupted delivery windows, most people won't question the price hike because storms make everything more expensive. But those supplier codes weren't random at all, as they mapped directly to older estate service access points. I didn't know the how yet, but I knew the coding structure was legacy, built on a pre-digital logic that big old properties never fully kill. A knock landed at the door. "Come in." A kitchen maid stepped inside, carrying fresh tea and a plate of butter biscuits I hadn't asked for. She was young, her cheeks red from the heat below stairs, and she was clearly trying not to stare at the paper spread across my desk. "You haven't eaten," she said. "I've had fraud for breakfast." That got a startled laugh out of her, a real one, which was a good sign. She set the tray down, but hovered near the edge of the desk. "Cook says if you're going to save this house, you should probably do it with something warm in your stomach." I looked up at her. "Cook says that?" "Cook says a lot of things that no one upstairs ever hears." Now that actually interested me. I took a biscuit and offered a small nod. "Then tell Cook I appreciate the tactical support." Her grin came quick. "I'm Mara. Victoria." "I know." Of course she did, because in houses like this, names move through the halls faster than a fire. She glanced toward the wall shared with Thiago's library and lowered her voice to a whisper. "You'll want the real pantry numbers, not the ones they use for the presentations." I held perfectly still. "There are 2 sets?" Her eyes widened as if she'd realized she said too much. "I didn't say that." "No, you didn't." Then she was gone, leaving behind the scent of butter, black tea, and a much bigger problem than I'd anticipated. I pulled the pantry sheets back out and checked them against the service logs, finding missing transfer marks and rounded totals everywhere. There was pretty formatting where the ugly reality should have been, and it was clear someone had been counting on distance, weather, and rank to keep the truth soft. I'd built my entire career on exactly this kind of thing. Powerful men miss waste all the time, but not because they lack the vision to see it. Usually, it's because it serves their interests not to look, and that's the part that keeps me sharp. I wasn't here to be impressed by stone walls or alpha posture. I was here because systems always confess if you press the weak seam long enough. A shadow moved across the glass of the interior door. I looked up. Thiago stood on the other side, silent and watching me through the pane with that same heavy stillness. What irritated me most was that even before he entered the room, my whole body already knew he was there. He came in without making a sound. One second I had ledgers, steam, and the soft scrape of my pencil, and the next, the room felt like it had more gravity in it. Thiago shut the door behind him and looked over the desk, his eyes moving once across my notes, the stacked invoices, and the flagged vendor codes. "You found something." I found enough to stop pretending this is just a run of bad luck. He put both hands on the back of the chair across from me, but didn't sit down. "Talk." So I did, laying out the food overages, the false storm inflation, and the heating allocations that didn't match the occupied space. Then I turned one page and tapped the supplier cluster I'd marked in red ink. These codes are built on old estate logic and legacy route tagging. Whoever built this system buried the current theft under historical access points, which means the paper trail won't be enough to solve this. I need a walkthrough. His gaze stayed fixed on the page. Of what? Everything that bleeds heat, weight, or supply. I need to see the retaining walls, the lower boiler lines, the sealed corridors, and the service runs. If someone is moving goods through this house, the structure is going to know it before the staff does. That finally got his attention. He straightened up, moving slow and dangerous in that tired way of his. You think the estate itself is part of the problem? I think buildings are honest when people aren't. For a beat, he just looked at me, and the firelight pulled copper tones from the dark gold of his eyes. Then he reached for his coat from the arm of the sofa. Fine, he said. Get your boots and gloves. You're coming with me. The cold outside the west doors had teeth. The moment we stepped into the mountain air, the wind bit through my wool coat and made my eyes water. Sleet needled my cheeks while the estate rose behind us in black stone and iron, its windows lit warm against the storm like the building had blood in it. Thiago walked beside me without hunching once against the wind, which was frankly rude. We started at the retaining wall above the lower yard. I crouched by the stone and brushed my gloved fingers over the mortar seams, finding 3 repair patches that were clearly newer than the rest. These were done fast. That happened after a spring slide. It was done badly after a spring slide, I said. The drainage release is wrong, and now the water is pushing back into the foundation line. He looked down where I was pointing. Would that matter right now? It already does. We moved on to the boiler corridor, which was significantly worse. Heat rolled through the service level in ugly waves, feeling too hot in one stretch and almost dead in the next. The pipes rattled behind the wall with a strained metallic chatter that set my teeth on edge, so I pressed my palm to the stone and felt a vibration where there should have been none. This line was rerouted, I said. Thiago's head turned toward me. How can you tell? Because the wall is warmer here than it is at the joint, and that makes no sense unless someone forced the run through a narrower chase. It's carrying weight and heat where the original plans wouldn't have allowed it. I stood up and looked him in the eye. Who approved the modifications to the sealed wings? His expression changed, a small shift that carried a big meaning. No one was supposed to. There it is. The silence broke under the sharp hiss of steam. He moved closer, enough that the cold air between us started to thin. You're saying someone altered the structure without any record. I'm saying your house is carrying secrets in load-bearing places, and that's never a cheap thing to do. Something hard flashed behind his eyes, maybe pride or maybe anger. You speak about this estate like it's a body on your table. It is, I said, and someone's been cutting pieces off it while you were busy standing guard at the head. That landed. I saw it land. His jaw locked and the air around him sharpened, that alpha vibration dropping low enough to vibrate in my own chest. It wasn't loud, but it was worse because it was contained. But he didn't snap at me. He looked past me toward a narrow corridor, half hidden behind a mesh gate and an iron service door. It was reinforced much more recently than the surrounding wall, featuring clean welds and the wrong hinges, with no visual reason for the upgrade. I followed his stare. That, I said, doesn't belong to the original build. The storm hit the outer stone with a hard, hollow thud. Thiago went perfectly still beside me. And I knew, right then, that this had stopped being a simple money problem. He let me into the archive wing the next afternoon, but only after he leaned in and muttered, "You stay where I can see you," in a tone that made it clear he wasn't negotiating. I charge extra for babysitting, I said, meeting his gaze without blinking. And yet here you are, he countered, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space between us. The room sat on the east side of the estate, behind a steel-banded oak door and a lock far too modern for the ancient stone surrounding it. Inside, the air was biting and paper dry, smelling of old vellum, dust, and the sharp bite of cedar oil. Shelves climbed toward the ceiling in tight, shadowed rows that felt like they were closing in. Maps hung in heavy glass frames alongside tax ledgers, inheritance rolls, and trade agreements. It was a whole history of power, bound in leather and stacked by the decade. But something about the arrangement felt off. Right away, the entire collection felt picked over. It wasn't ransacked, which actually would have been easier to deal with, because this was curated damage. I noticed gaps where there should have been a perfect sequence, and missing years in the estate expense logs. Sign-out cards had been replaced too neatly, and one shelf of family transfer records had shifted half an inch to the left. Someone had clearly removed specific volumes and then tried to close the mouth of the space to hide the theft. I slipped on my gloves and started pulling records by rain period, while the silence of the room settled over us like a heavy blanket. Thiago stayed near the central table with his arms folded, watching me work with a heavy stillness that should have made me nervous, but somehow just made me sharper. "You already know something's missing," he said, his presence taking up more than its fair share of the room. "I know someone wants it to look less missing than it is," I replied, pulling a heavy book from the shelf. I opened a tax ledger from the final years of his father's rule and found 3 pages had been cut out with a blade so clean the stitching barely frayed. This wasn't a crime of rage, but one of absolute precision. I turned another page and found the exact same thing, which confirmed my suspicion that this was a professional job. The silence was absolute for a moment before the heavy door swung open. Jaden stepped in, with 2 guards trailing behind him, wearing that same smooth expression I already disliked on principle. "Thiago, Victoria." "I was told the archives were opened," he said, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls. "Now you know," I said, without looking up from the ledger. His smile flickered for a second before he smoothed it back into place. "I like a woman who enjoys procedure." "No, you like knowing who touched what," I shot back, finally meeting his eyes. That one landed exactly where I wanted it to. He walked further into the room anyway, his coat immaculate and his boots barely making a sound on the stone floor. Size wasn't his threat, but control was, the kind that looks polished because it expects to be obeyed without question. "If you need access logs, I can provide them," he offered, though his tone suggested it was more of a warning than a help. "I'm sure you can," I said, leaning back against the table. "The real question is whether I'd be getting the first version or the right one." One of the guards shifted uncomfortably, and while Thiago didn't move, the air in the room tightened around him like a physical weight. Jaden's eyes turned cool as he focused entirely on me. "You think I'm involved." "I think you answer too fast," I told him, watching for any crack in the mask. A beat passed while we stared each other down. Then he laughed softly, a sound that felt like silk over a blade, as if I had genuinely amused him. "That's the trouble with auditors. You mistake competence for guilt." "No," I said, turning the ledger toward him so he could see the evidence. "I mistake duplicate seals for fraud." That did it. His gaze dropped to the page where 2 approval marks sat at the bottom of the invoice cluster. Both carried the official estate authorization, but they were slightly different in pressure and wax spread. It was the same signet pattern, but a wrong duplication. And in a house like this, only one seal should have existed on that class of transfer. Jaden recovered too quickly, which was a tell in itself. "Clerical duplication." "On restricted goods tied to legacy routing?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. His jaw ticked once, and there it was, the tiny fracture in his perfect composure. I felt Thiago watching both of us now, his intensity of physical heat at my back. Jaden straightened his coat and looked away from the book. "If there's a problem in the records, we'll investigate it." "We?" I asked, letting the word hang in the air. His thin, polished smile came back. "Security protects estate assets." I closed the ledger with a heavy thud, and sometimes helps move them. The air shifted hard as Thiago stepped closer to the table, not touching either of us, but somehow taking up all the remaining space. "Enough." Jaden looked at him first, completely ignoring me, which told me exactly where the fear lived in this hierarchy. "I only came to assist," Jaden said, though he was already backing toward the exit. "No," I said quietly. "You came to measure what I've seen." For the first time since I'd met him, Jaden didn't have a quick answer ready. He gave Thiago a short, stiff nod and then turned for the door. "Call if you need anything." I watched him leave, every instinct in me pulling tight like a bowstring. When the door finally shut, I realized my shoulders had gone rigid from the tension. Thiago noticed it too. "Dust?" he asked, his voice too dry to be innocent. I exhaled once, trying to shake off the chill. "Danger." Because he heard the truth in that, dinner became the next battlefield. Dinner was held in a room designed to make any disagreement feel small and insignificant. There was a long black table surrounded by high-backed chairs, with silver cutlery catching the firelight in thin, cold flashes. Portraits of dead pack leaders stared down from the walls like they still expected obedience from the living. The storm pressed hard against the tall windows, and every now and then the glass gave a soft tick from the sleet hitting the pane. Inside, the atmosphere was a thick mix of heat, candle wax, roasted meat, and old money, with tension packed so tight I could almost taste the metal. Thiago walked in beside me, and even though he wasn't touching me, his presence felt more noticeable than a hand on my arm would have been. I had changed into the least offensive dress I owned, which was dark wool with clean lines and nothing fussy. It was professional and sharp, the outfit of a woman here to read numbers, rather than someone who would pour wine and nod at men twice her age. The elders were already seated when we arrived. There were 5 of them tonight, 2 women and 3 men, all wearing expensive clothes and careful faces. They had that brittle, upper-class stillness people wear when they think their rank should do all the heavy lifting for them. Jaden stood near the far wall with the guard detail, his hands loose behind his back and his expression as smooth as polished stone. One of the older men lifted his glass and looked right at me. "So this is the auditor." It wasn't a greeting, but I hadn't expected one. "This is Victoria," Thiago said, his voice cutting through the room. The elder barely acknowledged the name or my presence. An outsider. I pulled out my own chair and sat down before anyone could offer it to me. A paid one, which usually means I'm actually useful. That comment got me 3 different reactions at once. One woman's mouth tightened in a thin line. Another elder blinked in clear offense, and Thiago just went very still at the head of the table. He looked like he was deciding whether to stop me or just sit back and enjoy the show. The first course landed on the table, but I didn't touch it. A woman with silver rings and perfect posture gave me a cool, calculated smile. "We were told you specialize in forensic review." "I do." "How charming," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A woman who counts potatoes and calls it strategy." I looked at her plate and then back at her. If enough potatoes go missing in the middle of winter, it becomes strategy very fast. A few servants near the wall went carefully blank, though one of them looked like he was fighting a smile. The man at the far end of the table snorted. "You think this house is being robbed?" "I think your ledgers are lying to you," I said. The room changed shape around that sentence. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but there was a subtle tightening in the air, like everyone had inhaled at once and was refusing to let it out. Jaden's gaze slid to me, cool and bright with interest. Across the table, one elder reached for his wine far too quickly, and the woman beside him set her fork down with a delicate but deliberate force. Thiago said nothing, which was a smart move on his part. The silver-ringed woman leaned back in her chair. That's a strong claim for someone who only arrived yesterday. I didn't need any longer than that because fraud always leaves a scent. Jaden spoke then, his voice smooth as oil. "Victoria has flagged some irregularities in seasonal procurement, but that's nothing unusual for a storm-locked estate." I turned my head toward him, refusing to let him downplay what I'd found. Duplicate authorization seals are unusual, and inflated route billing is definitely unusual. Most importantly, legacy vendor coding tied to sealed service access is very unusual. The elder who had reached for his glass looked up too fast at that last point. And there it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. It was just a glance, barely a flick of the eyes from him to Jaden and then back again. But I saw it, and I knew Thiago saw me see it too. The man at the head of the lower end of the table slammed his palm softly against the wood. "This line of inquiry ends tonight." "No," Thiago said. It was just one word, quiet and final, but it carried enough weight to shift the entire room. Every candle in that space may as well have leaned toward him. He set his glass down and looked at the table, his gaze moving over every person there. The audit continues. The silence that followed was thick enough to stand in. No one challenged him directly, which told me almost as much as the ledgers had. He still held the ultimate power here. But the real question was, how much of it was being drained away behind his back? Dessert came with a wine so over-oaked it tasted like punishment in a crystal glass. I took one sip and nearly winced, thinking about how rich people will preserve absolutely anything if it costs enough money. Then the air shifted. A sound moved through the wall behind me, something faint and rhythmic that didn't belong. It wasn't the clink of cutlery or the murmur of voices, but a low, repeating vibration deep under the stone. I turned my head slowly toward the sealed corridor beyond the dining room paneling. In that same second, I knew two things for certain. Something was moving behind the walls of this house, and whatever peace this dinner had pretended to offer was already over. I waited until the corridor finally went quiet. It wasn't the polite silence of a dinner party or the soft hush of a normal house, but the heavy, real quiet that only settles after the heavy doors shut and the people with rank decide they are done pretending for the night. I blew out one lamp, leaving the fire to burn low, and stood in my stockings with my ear pressed against the paneled wall that separated my room from the dark corridor beyond. There it was, a pulse. It was soft and rhythmic, sounding far too steady for loose plumbing, and much too deliberate for old stone settling during a mountain storm. My brain finally rebooted, but my heart wasn't listening to logic, so I grabbed the small wax impression kit from my case and slid open my door to step into the hall. The stone bit cold into my bare soles as I moved through the shadows. Wind pressed hard at the windows down the long corridor, and somewhere deep below the floorboards, the boilers gave a long, strained hiss that sounded like a warning. I moved toward the sealed panel near the dining room turn because my eyes had marked it earlier when I noticed the wood grain didn't quite line up with the surrounding wall. Up close, the craftsmanship was even worse, with a seam that was too clean in two places and far too rough in another. Someone had opened this before, and based on the wear, they had done it more than once. I crouched down to touch the molding and felt the slick texture of old polish mixed with dust, where there shouldn't have been any dust at all. A draft so faint it barely brushed my knuckles leaked through the gap. "Come on," I whispered. I pressed the wax into the edge of what looked like decorative ironwork, searching for the hidden mechanism by feel, while the corridor filled with the scent of stone, burnt oil, and the last ghost of roasted herbs from dinner. My fingers finally found a small notch in the metal. Then boots sounded at the far stair. I froze. 2 guards were approaching with low voices, and they were coming straight toward my position. Panic hit before I could think, so I slipped into the alcove beside a narrow statue plinth and flattened myself into the shadow, with the wax kit clenched so hard it dug into my palm. The guards passed close enough that I could hear the leather of their gear creak and the sound of damp wool dripping from their heavy coats. "Jaden said no one uses this wing tonight," one of them muttered. "Then why post us here?" the other replied. There was a short beat of silence. "You asked too many questions," the first one snapped. They kept moving until their footsteps faded into the distance. I waited until the sound of their steps was completely gone, then I exhaled so slowly it actually hurt my chest. "You're either very brave," a voice said behind me, low and rough, "or you are very committed to making my life harder." I turned too fast and nearly collided with Thiago's chest. He was just there, a wall of heat and corded strength, filling the narrow hall until the air felt thin and electric. One of his hands was braced on the wall beside my shoulder, not touching me, but blocking every easy exit I had. The scent of cedar and smoke wrapped around me so fast, it felt like being caught in a physical trap. "What are you hunting?" he asked. I tipped my chin up because I was not about to shrink away during my own ambush. "Your house is breathing wrong." For 1 second, he didn't move at all. Then the air shifted. It wasn't subtle or imagined, but a total stillness in his body that meant recognition rather than disbelief. His gaze cut to the wall seam for a moment before snapping back to mine. "You heard it too," I said. He looked down the dark corridor with his jaw held tight. "Since I was a boy." That admission landed harder than I expected it to. Stormlight flashed silver through the far window, and the next roll of thunder came deep and slow, sounding like the mountain itself was clearing its throat. Thiago lowered his voice so only I could hear him. "Old passageways run through this side of the estate from the war years, serving as smuggling routes and shelter points, though most were sealed after my grandfather's time. Most, I repeated. His eyes came back to mine, and close like this, they were less gold and more of a burnished amber that looked dark at the center. He looked tired, more tired than a man with his level of control should have ever let anyone see. "I'll show you one route at dawn," he said, "but not tonight." "And if I say I'm going right now?" "Then I carry you back to your room." I believed him instantly, which was incredibly annoying. The silence broke under the storm's hard rattle against the glass, and we stood there breath close, both listening to the faint vibration behind the wall, like the house was keeping time under our skin. Then he straightened his posture and stepped back. "Dawn," he said. And because he'd given me the truth, instead of just giving me orders, I nodded. For now. Dawn came gray and mean. I woke before the knock because the house had already started moving around me, with pipes clicking and wind scraping sleet across the glass. A low boiler hiss moved through the walls like the estate was trying to breathe through clenched teeth, so I pulled on yesterday's sweater and shoved my feet into my boots. I stepped into the corridor with far too little sleep and a heavy awareness of the door at the end of the hall. Thiago was already waiting for me. He wore no coat, just a dark Henley with the sleeves pushed up, and his hair was still rough from sleep. It shouldn't have made him look more dangerous, but it did, and he tipped his head once toward the service stair. "Kitchen first," he said. "I thought we were inspecting tunnels." "We are, but only after we have caffeine." "Is it that bad?" I asked. His eyes slid to me, heavy and unreadable. "You'll see." The lower kitchen was almost empty at that hour, filled only with a banked fire, warm stone, and the soft clink of one pot settling on the iron range. The storm pressed white at the high windows while a kettle muttered on the edge of the heat, and the whole room smelled like bitter roast, hot metal, yeast, and wood smoke. Thiago crossed to the long table and poured from a black iron pot into 2 thick mugs before handing one to me. The scent hit me first. It was burnt and harsh, so over-extracted that it made my jaw tense up before I even tasted it. I took one cautious sip and stopped immediately. "Oh, that's awful." His brow moved maybe half an inch. "It's coffee." "It's an assault," I corrected. That finally got his full attention. He leaned one hip against the work table with his mug in hand, watching me with a slow kind of focus that felt more intense than an open challenge. "Do you always insult hospitality before the sun comes up?" "I always tell the truth before sunrise, because it's much easier to maintain the standard that way." I looked into the mug again. This is far too bitter. "It wakes me up." "No, it punishes you into consciousness." For one beat, nothing moved in the room but the steam rising from our cups. Then he took a drink while keeping his eyes locked on mine. "No one else complains." "That's only because no one here tells you the truth." The silence broke. It wasn't a loud noise, but a change in the atmospheric pressure, like the heavy air right before a lightning strike. He set his mug down and pushed off the table, and before I could even register the movement, he was standing right in front of me. The heat of him cut through the kitchen chill in one hard sweep, bringing the scent of cedar, smoke, and black coffee with it. My pulse jumped once, feeling stupid and immediate. Thiago lifted my mug from my hand, then he took his own and wrapped those big fingers around the handle to press the rim to my mouth. "Sweeten it," he said. His voice was low enough that I could feel it vibrate in my chest. The ceramic touched my lower lip, and heat bloomed there first, followed by the brutal scent of the coffee and the overwhelming presence of him. He wasn't forcing me, which would have been simpler to handle, but instead, he was offering a test held in total stillness. It was a challenge I could have stepped back from if I really wanted to. I didn't. I took the sip. It was still absolutely terrible. I swallowed the liquid and kept my eyes on his. Bitterness covers bad beans and bad judgment, and you really should demand better. For one second, I actually thought he might laugh. Instead, his mouth shifted into the edge of a smile that looked dragged low and dangerous. "You critique everything, don't you?" "Only the things that are built to survive." He was so close, I could see the dark fan of his lashes and the night fatigue still clinging to the edges of his eyes. I could feel the corded strength in the arm holding the mug, which stayed as steady as iron, and the kitchen went silent around us until there was no kettle and no wind. There was just our breath and the heat and that strange, sharp pull under my ribs. Then boots hit the stone in the outer passage. They were moving fast. A young guard appeared in the doorway, looking pale and breathing hard. "Thiago, the supply sled from the lower route is missing." The space between us snapped instantly. Thiago stepped back at once, and all that warmth turned into cold command. What was on it? Medicine, boiler parts, and 2 crates that are currently unaccounted for. I set my mug down on the table. Paper only tells half the lie. But now, the lie finally had tracks. We were moving before the guard even finished his sentence. Thiago grabbed his heavy coat off a wooden peg by the door and shrugged into it with one hard, practiced motion. I was already reaching for the ledger notes I'd tucked into my pocket, because if medicine and boiler parts were vanishing on estate grounds, this wasn't just a neat financial bleed anymore. This was operational sabotage, and the air in the room suddenly felt thin and electric. "Where was the shipment last seen?" I asked as we hit the service corridor. "Addergate checkpoint," the guard said, practically jogging to keep up with Thiago's long, predatory stride. "It should have reached the lower stores 20 minutes later, but it never showed up." Thiago's voice went flat in that way that made everyone around him move twice as fast. "Who signed the receipt at the gate?" "Ronan." "And the lower stores?" "No receipt was ever filed." Of course it wasn't. The corridor dropped into the rear yard through a heavy stone arch, and the mountain cold slapped me full in the face. The snow had thickened from a miserable sleet into sharp white grain that blew sideways across the open ground. Stable hands were already shouting over one another near the loading track, their voices thin against the wind. 2 wolves in heavy coats stood arguing beside an empty hitch post, while a medic stood nearby, clutching an open crate manifest in one gloved hand with a look of quiet panic. This was the kind of failure that hurt people fast. No heating parts meant the rooms would be freezing by nightfall, and missing medicine in a mountain lockdown meant the weak would get weaker first. It would hit the children and the elders, or anyone already running on thin reserves, and the thought of it made my stomach twist. I stopped beside the loading lane and crouched down in the dirt. Thiago turned back to look at me. "What are you doing?" "Seeing if your thieves are stupid." The snow was trying its best to bury the evidence, but it wasn't moving fast enough to hide the truth. 2 sled patterns cut through the yard and headed down the lower route, and at first glance, they looked like one outbound track and one return. It was nice, clean, and very believable, but the pressure marks in the slush told a completely different story. One runner line bit deeper on the left before correcting itself, which signaled a false weight distribution from a decoy load. The second set of tracks sat much lighter than the manifest should have allowed, meaning the real cargo was somewhere else. I stood up and pointed toward the tree line. "You had 2 sleds." Thiago followed the line of my hand. "Only one was scheduled." "Exactly. One made a big show of being heavy, while the other was actually carrying less than it should have. Someone wanted the witnesses to remember the wrong shape." The medic stepped closer, her eyes wide with realization. "Can you tell where they split off?" I nodded toward the dark tree line below the east wall. "Right there. See how the packed snow fans out? One route angles toward the lower stores, but the other cuts shallow and disappears under the drift because it hugged the old retaining grade." Thiago looked at me then, and it wasn't the look he gave a contractor. He looked at me like a partner he needed to move with, his gaze heavy and focused. "Take me there." So we went. The wind got meaner once we passed the protection of the wall. Snow hissed over the stone and caught in my lashes, making it hard to see. Thiago stayed close enough that I could feel the radiating heat of his body each time the path narrowed. He wasn't touching me, which was somehow worse, because his heavy and controlled presence stayed right at my shoulder, while my brain mapped out the grade changes and old service access points. Halfway down the slope, I finally found what I was looking for. A torn strip of black oilcloth was caught on a jag of iron near a drainage cut, and right under it, there was a deep gouge in the snow where a runner had clipped a rock. "This sled was lighter," I said, pointing to the mark. It wasn't because it carried less by accident, but because the high-value crates came off before the descent. Where would they take them? I looked up at the massive estate wall and then down to the half-buried stone vent built into the slope. "The mountain," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Or rather, what's sitting right under your house." His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. "The tunnels. Your books flagged those legacy vendor codes, and now your yard just confirmed a physical diversion. Whoever's stealing isn't waiting for an outside transfer because they're moving the goods inward." A groom came running through the deep snow from above. "Jaden says he's securing the lower stores now." Thiago's expression changed by exactly 1 degree, and it was a very bad degree. "Of course he is," I said. "Fraud likes the scene of the crime almost as much as it likes the paperwork, and Jaden was right in the middle of it." Thiago looked toward the vent where the white storm was chewing at the mountain. Then he turned back to me. "If you're right about this, it isn't just a simple theft." "No," I said, my breath smoking in the air between us. "It's staging. Someone is starving your estate and making it look like the weather did it." The silence between us broke under a fresh howl of wind. Then he gave me one sharp, decisive nod. "We go below." And just like that, the lie in the ledgers opened up into the dark tunnels under the mountain. The entrance sat behind a half-buried iron grate built into the slope. It looked like the mountain had grown teeth, and someone had taught it how to hide them from the world. Thiago wrenched the grate open with one hand, and the old rust screamed in protest. Cold air poured out of the opening, feeling older than the storm above us, and carrying the scent of damp stone and old iron. It had that stale mineral smell that places keep when the sunlight gave up on them a century ago. I clicked on the lantern one of the yardmen had shoved at us and stepped into the mouth of the cave first. "Stay behind me," Thiago commanded. "That's cute," I told him, not slowing down, "but I'm the one who actually knows what we're looking for." The tunnel sloped down in a long, narrow throat of jagged stone. Water ticked somewhere in the deep dark, and our footsteps came back to us off the walls in short, hollow echoes. The estate above felt suddenly mythic from down here, looking less like a house and more like a beast, with old bones threaded through the earth. Service marks had been carved into the walls decades ago, showing roots and storage arrows alongside faded emergency sigils from the war years, when hiding food was the only way to survive the winter. I ran my glove over one of the rough markings. These were used a lot. "During the sieges," Thiago said. His voice dropped lower in the confined space, and the sound of it rolled through the tunnel until it vibrated in my chest. "My grandfather kept half the pack alive through these passages. And now someone is using them to drain what's left of your legacy." We turned a sharp corner and found the proof. A steel door stood wide open at the end of a chamber, and light spilled through from a single hanging work lamp inside. The room beyond had once been used for storage, with shelves cut into the rock and old iron hooks hanging from the ceiling. Now it held stacked fuel drums and bundled boiler fittings, along with sacks of winter grain and 2 crates stamped as medical aid. To make matters worse, there was even a row of luxury wine cases lined up against the wall like a trophy. I let out a slow, shaky breath. "Well, there's your answer." Thiago stood in the doorway, his shoulders broad and perfectly still, and something in his posture went frighteningly quiet. "Count it." So I did. There was enough fuel to explain every heating discrepancy I'd found, along with the goods missing from the supply sled. The medical crates had been relabeled in chalk, and one ledger tag was half torn from a sack, perfectly matching the vendor code I'd flagged at my desk earlier that morning. The books had confessed, and now the mountain had done the same. I turned back toward him. "This isn't some side theft. This is organized by someone with access to your records, your routes, and the guard timing." Before you could answer me, the sound of metal slamming echoed from somewhere behind us. It was the tunnel gate. The sound cracked through the stone like a gunshot, making me jump. The work lamp flickered once and then died, and the outer corridor dropped into total darkness. For one long second, neither of us moved. Then Thiago lunged back toward the tunnel entrance and grabbed the iron handle. but he hit a locked brace from the other side. We were trapped. "Damn it," he bit out, his voice tight with anger. Dust shook loose from the ceiling as an old collapse alarm bell started clanging farther down the passage. It was a thin, frantic sound that set my nerves on edge. "Was that a real cave-in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," he said, tilting his head to listen. "That's a warning rig. It's a manual trigger." "So someone knows we found the stash?" "Yes." The chamber suddenly felt much smaller than it had a moment ago. It was getting colder, too, except for where Thiago was standing close enough that his heat cut through the damp air. The lantern glow carved hard, handsome planes from his face, and I could see the tension riding every line of his body. Then the silence finally broke. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question landed stupidly soft for a place as dangerous as this. "No. Are you?" He gave me a look that was almost a challenge. I've had worse mornings than this. That almost made me smile despite the situation. He checked the side wall and found an old service ladder, half hidden behind the shelving. He shoved the heavy rack aside with a burst of corded strength that made the metal shriek over the stone floor. "There's a shaft here that leads to the upper boiler hall." I moved to help him, standing shoulder to shoulder in the narrow dark while our breaths fogged white in the air. "You trust me very fast for a man who claims to like rules." His eyes found mine in the flickering lantern light. "I trust your mind. The rest of you is still under review." "Fair enough." We climbed out of there, filthy, cold, and absolutely furious. By the time we reached the upper service hatch, I knew two things for certain. The traitor was sitting very close to his power, and whatever was growing between us in the dark was becoming its own kind of dangerous risk. By the time we finally made it back upstairs, the chill had settled deep into my bones, and my hem was ruined with grit, leaving me more wired than any sane person should be before noon. Thiago didn't waste a second, sending for dry towels and food while demanding every shipment log from the last 4 months. But I didn't let the chaos sit. I took that mountain of data and forced it into a strict, logical order until my desk completely disappeared under layers of yellowing paper. The spread was a mess of approvals, patrol rotations, vendor schedules, and weather reports that sat alongside council visit dates and household access lists. I started building the pattern the way I always do, which means I wasn't looking for who looked guilty, but rather searching for where the system bent and who stood to benefit every time it did. My process always puts the numbers first and saves the egos for later, because math doesn't have a reason to lie to me. Thiago stood over by the fire with his coat off again, silently watching me turn a string of thefts into a solid structure. 3 people, I said, finally leaning back from the mess. He crossed the room in a few heavy strides. "Who?" I tapped the chart I'd spent the last hour constructing out of string, wax pencil, and a healthy dose of bad temper. "Jaden is the first, mostly because security reassignments spike right before every major loss. But your chief steward is also involved because store access logs are getting scrubbed too fast after every discrepancy. Then there is Elder Mateo." Thiago's eyes narrowed at the name. "Mateo handles the trade tariffs." "Exactly, which means he can hide price inflation without ever having to touch a physical crate." I drew a dark line between 2 marked dates to show him the connection. Watch how this works, because council visits happen, patrols change, and supply overages increase right as the outer routes suddenly hit weather delays that only seem to affect very specific goods. He looked down at the spread of evidence and went perfectly still. "This isn't just theft." "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's much worse than that, because someone is intentionally making you look weak." The room went quiet after I said it, the weight of the words hanging in the air between us. I turned another page to drive the point home. Missing fuel leads to cold rooms, missing medicine makes the staff frightened, and missing guards in the wrong places start whispers that you can't control your own house. This isn't about making a profit alone. It's about systematically starving the confidence your people have in you. His jaw flexed once, a hard, sharp movement. They're setting up a challenge. Or they're softening the estate so someone else can make a move. The silence that followed was absolute, wrapping around us like a blissful, heavy blanket until the fire popped and he exhaled through his nose. It looked like his anger had finally found a physical shape. A servant knocked and hurried in with a tray, vanishing almost as fast as they appeared. Thiago picked up the plate himself instead of calling me over to the table, bringing me a mix of bread, roast chicken, and hot potatoes dripping with way too much butter. He set the meal down right by my elbow without saying a single word. I looked up at him. Is this a strategy or just pity? Neither. His gaze held mine for a beat too long, the intensity of it making the air feel thick. You have a habit of forgetting to eat when you're close to an answer. That comment should not have done anything to me, but it did. I took a bite because my body suddenly remembered it actually existed. He stayed right there, bracing one hand on the desk so close that heat rolled off him in steady, magnetic waves. He wasn't touching me, and he was never careless with his space, which somehow made the proximity feel even worse. I solve systems, I said, focusing more on the paper than on the man looming over me. People are the only part of the equation I don't trust. His voice dropped into a low, subterranean rumble. You seem to trust your own read on me. I swallowed hard. I trust the fact that you hate losing control. A shadow of a smile touched his mouth for a fleeting second. That's not exactly the same thing. No, I admitted, it isn't. I marked one final line on the chart and felt the entire pattern lock into place. This is where it gets dark, I said quietly, pointing to the final set of figures. The money being bled from the estate is being used to buy loyalty quietly and selectively, which is enough to make certain guards and elders think the estate runs despite you, not because of you. Thiago went very still, his presence becoming heavy and dangerous. I turned to face him fully so he could see I wasn't guessing. This isn't just embezzlement with a few side benefits. It's a political move designed to build a case that you can't protect your own pack through the winter. His stare held mine, heavy and hot and furious in a way that had nothing to do with me personally. Then we stopped waiting for them to act. I nodded once, feeling the tension snap. Good, because the only way to prove this now is to force them to make a move in public. And just like that, the web I'd built stopped being a theory and became a trap that we were both standing inside. By the time dusk rolled around, the estate had managed to put its public face back on. Rows of candles burned in ranks down the length of the great hall, making the silver flash against the dark wood, while music drifted softly from a quartet hidden behind carved screens. The storm was still clawing at the windows outside, but inside the walls, everything was designed to project order, wealth, and absolute control. If you didn't know any better, you'd think this house wasn't currently bleeding out from the inside. I knew better. So did Thiago. We stood together in the antechamber just outside the hall, while a servant fussed over his cuff. Mostly because nervous people always need a task to keep their hands busy. He looked brutal in black, but it wasn't a polished kind of look. It was the kind of clean, sharp control that makes everyone else in the room instinctively check their own pulse. His hair was pushed back, and his shoulders filled the entire doorway, while the low vibration of his presence sat in the air like a physical warning. I handed him a folded note containing the specific lines I wanted him to use. You need to say it exactly like this. He glanced down at my handwriting. You're remarkably bossy for someone who has technically hired help. You're welcome, I shot back. That almost smile touched his mouth again before it vanished into a mask of stone. Walk me through the plan one more time. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low so no one else could overhear. You need to mention the hidden inheritance exposure first, rather than the supply theft or the missing fuel, because that will send the wrong people looking at the wrong fire. Then you just watch, because Mateo should get loud, and the steward will likely go pale, but Jaden will try his best not to react at all. And if he doesn't give us anything, he will, because men who live their lives by control always react when they realize they've lost the script. His eyes stayed on me a beat too long, searching my face. You sound very sure of yourself. I am. The doors finally opened. A wave of heat, candle wax, roasted meat, and expensive perfume hit us as the whole room turned to see who was entering. Thiago offered me his arm, and I took it without hesitation, because this wasn't the time to pretend we hadn't become a single unit in the minds of everyone watching us. The feast rolled around us in polished, rhythmic waves of toasts and low conversation, while servants moved through the crowd with trained grace. I let the room settle into its rhythm before I started studying the faces at the table. Matteo sat halfway down with his soft hands and a practiced trade smile, while the chief steward stood near the service doors, clutching a ledger way too tight under his arm. Jaden was holding the wall, looking as calm and cold as winter glass. When the second course finally landed, Thiago set down his wine glass and spoke loud enough for the entire table to hear. My auditor has identified some serious irregularities tied to an old inheritance reserve. The effect of those words was immediate and visceral. Matteo's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, frozen in midair. The steward blinked several times in rapid succession before reaching for a glass of water he clearly didn't need. Jaden did absolutely nothing. That was the problem. He didn't show surprise, confusion, or even a flicker of interest. There was only one measured inhale, and a stillness so complete that it felt entirely rehearsed. I leaned slightly toward Thiago and whispered, for his ears only, "There." He didn't look at me, but his posture shifted. "I see it." Matteo was the first one to recover his senses. An inheritance reserve? Surely this is just a simple misunderstanding. I cut in before Thiago had to say a word. "Then I'm sure you'll be relieved when we start the full records review tomorrow." One of the elders at the far end of the table made a small, disgusted sound. This woman again. I turned my head to meet his eyes. "Still here, yes." The elder's lip curled in a sneer. "Outsiders don't get to disrupt the governance of this pack just because they found a few messy sums in a book." Thiago's hand landed firmly at the small of my back. It was just a touch. It was warm, firm, and possessive enough to bring the entire room to a standstill. He looked directly at the elder without even needing to raise his voice. "She stays." A current of pure power ran through the hall, and it had nothing to do with romance. It was the sound of a rumor starting in real time, and I could almost hear the stories building themselves in the minds of the guests. Then a sudden movement caught my eye. Near the side colonnade, a young messenger dressed in a state gray slipped out of the hall with an inventory strip half hidden in his fist. He was moving too fast and being too careful, which meant he was running a warning to someone. I pushed back my chair, the wood scraping loudly against the stone. Thiago's hand tightened on me once. "Victoria." "He's carrying news," I said, already calculating the distance to the door. "And what happens if you chase him?" I looked toward the arch where the boy had vanished into the shadows. "Then maybe we can stop the message before it reaches the man who still thinks he's 3 steps ahead of us." I was already moving toward the exit before my own caution could even think about catching up. I caught the messenger just past the side court where the wind hit like a sudden slap and snow turned the flagstones slick under my boots. He glanced back once, saw me closing the distance, and started running even harder. So I ran too. The service court opened into the lower terraces in a blur of white, black railings and half-buried statuary, while my breath burned fast and the cold knifed through my lungs. The man ahead of me moved like he knew the grounds perfectly, cutting left through a narrow arch and down the old path that dropped along the ravine side. Bad route. I knew it the second I saw the drift pattern. The snow lay too smooth and too clean because it was wind-packed over weak ground, but instinct had already shoved me forward before sense could catch up. By the time I realized the danger, I was 3 strides onto the lower shelf, with nothing but a dark drop to my right and mountain stone to my left. The messenger stopped 20 feet ahead. He wasn't scared. He was waiting. Well, that was clarifying. He turned just enough for me to see the edge of a grin under his scarf. Then he tossed something small into the snow at my feet and backed away. The first crack sounded almost delicate. I froze. Ice spidered under the drift in thin silver lines that weren't pond ice but shelf ice, forming a thin skin over runoff and empty air. My stomach dropped so hard it felt physical, and the sheer weight of the mistake hit me all at once. "You stupid little..." The second crack cut me off. The whole ledge shifted. Snow slumped under my boots as one heel slipped, and cold terror punched straight through my spine while I threw my weight toward the wall. My fingers scraped against the rough stone, but the outer edge gave with a brittle groan, and suddenly the entire world tilted. Then heat hit my back. An arm locked around my waist so hard it stole my breath, and another hand caught the front of my coat to anchor me. Thiago slammed into me from behind with enough force to drive us both sideways into the rock face, just as the shelf sheared away where I had been standing. Ice and snow crashed into the ravine below. For one wild second, I couldn't hear anything except the frantic thud of my own pulse. Thiago's chest was at my back, solid and hot and heaving, and his grip bit through my wool coat with an absolute unyielding strength. The scent hit me next, a sensory collision of cold air, cedar, storm, and male heat that vibrated in my chest and made the relief feel dangerous. "Are you out of your mind?" he snarled into my ear. I twisted in his hold, furious because he was right. He was getting away. He was baiting you. I know that now. His hand stayed on me 1 second longer than necessary. Then he let go all at once and stepped past me to the edge to scan the slope below. But the messenger was already gone. In the broken snow near the drop, something dark caught against the white where he'd thrown it, half buried and waiting to be found. I crouched and dug it out with numb fingers. It was a wax-sealed token. The security crest sat on one side and a private route mark on the other, which meant only one person could have sent it. Jaden. Thiago saw it, and the air around him changed from frustrated to something tight and lethal that was much worse than shouting. He sent a runner. Or he has someone loyal enough to move without asking, I said, clutching the token as I stood up. Either way, your security chief just reached too far. He turned on me then, his anger and fear braided so tight I could see both fighting for control. You do not chase men into a whiteout alone. And you do not get to bark at me after using me as bait all night. His jaw flexed. I did not use you. I laughed once, sharp and breathless. Thiago, please. Half this house already thinks I'm standing at your side, and that hand on my back earlier was a message. Yes, he said. It was a message to them, but it wasn't permission for you to run into a ravine. The silence broke hard between us. Snow hissed over the stone while my hands started shaking now that the danger had passed, and I hated that he could see my weakness. He hated that he could see it too, and I watched the moment it hit him, what almost happened, and what he almost didn't reach in time. His expression shifted first. Then, without warning, he pulled me back against him. It wasn't a claim or a performance for the staff. It was a hard, grounding hold, with both arms around me and his breath rough above my temple. The relief of surrender hit me so fast it made my knees weak. And because that terrified me almost as much as the drop had, I shoved at his chest. He let me go. Good. Also awful. We take this inside, I said, holding up the token. Thiago nodded once, his eyes still fixed on my face. You're under guard tonight. I'm going to hate that. I know. By the time we got back inside, the storm had turned vicious, and the wind hit the stone in long, hard shoves. Somewhere high above us, a shutter banged twice before going silent, and my room felt warm for all of 10 seconds before we opened the door. Then the hearth coughed black. Smoke rolled out low and ugly, thick enough to sting my eyes, so I stepped back fast while covering my mouth. A maid yelped from the corridor as 2 footmen came running with blankets, and one look up the flue told me exactly what the problem was. Draft collapse, I said. Locked stack, the older footman agreed, already pulling the fire grate wide because the snow had driven in from the north turn. Thiago didn't waste time. Move her. The maid blinked. To which chamber? His gaze cut to me first, then back to her. My suite. That landed on the staff like dropped silver. I coughed once, waved the smoke from my face, and told him I was thrilled the house continued to make choices for me. It's for heat efficiency, he said. And gossip containment, the maid added too quickly, then looked like she wanted to fall through the floor. I pointed at her. At least someone here is honest. 10 minutes later, my case, ledger box, and remaining dignity had all been transferred into Thiago's rooms. His suite was warmer than mine by a full degree or two because it had thicker walls and better draft lines. The sitting room fire burned clean and deep with amber light, while dark shelves climbed one wall and a broad sofa sat near the hearth. Beyond an open arch, I could see the edge of his bedroom, which felt like too much shadow and too much of him. The scent hit me at once. It was cedar, smoke, clean wool, and the faint trace of black coffee that still lingered in the air. It was a sensory collision of heat and mail order, and my tired brain hated how quickly it logged every single detail. A servant left extra blankets while another brought tea, and then the doors shut until a heavy silence settled over us. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was worse. It was a lived-in one. I set my token, notes, and gloves on the table. "So, your room." He shrugged out of his coat. "Temporary." That's what people say right before they become a scandal. His mouth twitched. "You became a scandal when you chased a messenger into a ravine." "Fair." The silence broke under a hiss from the fire as I sank onto the sofa because my legs had finally realized what almost happened outside. Thiago noticed at once, and without a word, he took the thick wool blanket from the chair and draped it over my shoulders. I looked up. If this is another command disguised as care, I'd like the record to show I remain difficult. It's not disguised. That shut me up for a second. He sat at the other end of the sofa, angled toward the fire with one arm stretched along the back cushion behind me, but not touching. He was close enough to feel, but not close enough to blame, and the heat from the hearth soaked into my boots, while the heat from him did something worse. I wrapped the blanket tighter. "Your coffee is still terrible." He let out a low breath that almost counted as a laugh. "And yet you survived it." "Barely, because I've had cleaner fuel from a tractor." "That's insulting to both me and the beans." "Good." The room went quiet again, softer this time, in the way that sneaks up on you after too much adrenaline. My eyes drifted over the stonework near his desk, and that was when I saw a hairline seam in the wall with an iron edge. It was a hidden lockbox set deep into the masonry, and it was nearly invisible unless you knew how to read pressure lines. Interesting. Thiago followed my gaze and went still. "You built a secret into the stone," I said. "It was here before me." His eyes narrowed. Don't. Don't what? "Start auditing my bedroom walls." I looked at him over the edge of the blanket. "That depends. Are they lying too?" For one stretched beat, he just watched me, while the firelight moved over his face and the gold warmed in his eyes. The tension stayed there, live and quiet between us, until he finally spoke. "Not tonight," he said. Not no. Trust turned sharp under my skin. I leaned back into the sofa, feeling the storm shove at the windows, while the blanket felt heavy over my lap, and his heat stayed steady at my side. I told myself I would rest for 1 hour, or maybe 2, but then the estate alarm started screaming before dawn. The alarm was not subtle. It ripped through the estate in long iron shrieks that bounced off the stone walls and slammed straight into my skull. I came off the sofa instantly, the blanket still tangled around my knees, but Thiago was already moving. 1 second, he was half turned toward me in the firelight, all dark hair and rough sleep and dangerous warmth, and the next he had a knife in one hand, while opening the suite door with the other. His whole body switched from a tired man to a pack leader so fast it made the room feel smaller. "Stay here," he said. I was already on my feet, dragging the blanket off and tossing it aside. "Absolutely not." His eyes hit mine, hard and unyielding. "Victoria." "The South stores hold the heating reserves," I said, grabbing my coat from the chair. "If this is sabotage, I'm going where the evidence is." For one beat, the air locked between us in a silent tug-of-war. Then he gave a sharp nod and muttered, "With me." We hit the corridor at speed. Staff spilled from the side halls in robes, boots, and half-fastened coats, while guards ran toward the lower stairs. The whole house smelled like smoke, cold stone, fear, and abruptly awakened bodies. Somewhere below us, another alarm bell took up the cry, sounding thinner and more frantic than the first. By the time we reached the south stores, the yard was pure chaos. Lanterns swung wildly in the wind, and snow blew sideways through the open loading arch. 2 workers tried to wrestle a damaged store door back onto its hinge, while a medic shouted for inventory counts over the roar of the storm. The lock plate had been forced from the outside, which wasn't weather damage at all, but clean leverage that looked entirely deliberate. Thiago stepped into the center of the yard, and everything seemed to bend around him. Report. A quartermaster snapped upright. Lower heating stores breached. 3 valve crates are gone, the coal reserve has been disturbed, and we found the manifest chest broken open. Jaden appeared out of the dark like he'd been poured there. He was moving too fast and looking too neat, with his hair in place and his coat buttoned up. He wasn't even breathing hard. "I've secured the perimeter," he said. "No one gets in or out without a search." I watched his face instead of listening to his words. He was calm, measured, and helpful in exactly the right proportions, and it made my teeth ache. Thiago looked at the broken lock and then the splintered chest. "Any witnesses?" "None," Jaden said smoothly. "The storm covered the approach." Of course it did. I stepped past him and crouched by the furnace room threshold, where slush had been tracked over the old stone. Burn marks dusted the floor near the firebox, but it wasn't coal ash. It was paper ash, thin and gray, still clinging in the corners where the draft had missed it. I pinched a scrap between my gloves and unfolded what was left to find numbers, a column edge, a shipment code, and half a route line. Someone had burned the manifest during the breach. "Thiago," I said. He came at once, but Jaden stayed right behind him, which I hated on instinct. I held up the scrap. This wasn't a smash and grab. They came for the records, too. Thiago's expression went flat in that dangerous way I was learning to read. "You're sure?" "It's a fresh burn and still dry at the center. They wanted the scene loud enough to pull everyone here, then they used the confusion to erase the paperwork." Jaden folded his arms. "Or panicked workers fed old trash to the furnace while they were responding." I stood up. "That would be a better theory if the scrap in my hand wasn't from tonight's store routing." His gaze met mine, cool as sleet. "You seem determined to make every shadow into a conspiracy. And you seem very comfortable standing in them." The silence broke under a hard gust that drove snow through the arch and sent the lantern flames bucking. Workers flinched, but Thiago did not. His attention stayed on Jaden for one long second too many, and then he looked at me. I saw the impulse there to confront him now and tear the whole thing open, but I shook my head once. Not yet. An accusation without closure would blow the case and scatter the ring, leaving us with nothing but smoke instead of proof. Thiago understood, and I could feel it in the way his jaw locked and then eased by sheer force of will. He turned back to the room and spoke, his voice carrying clean through the storm and the panic. "Double the guard on all store records. No one touches the furnace, the chest, or the root board until Victoria clears it." Jaden smiled, but it was too small and too polished. Because of that, I knew exactly what came next. We were done reacting, and now we were going to bait him. I wrote the false report in Thiago's war room, because lies need space if you want them to breathe right. The table was big enough for troop maps, council records, and the slow ruin of my patience. I spread clean paper over the wood and lined up the real ledgers beside the fake summary. And then I started building a version of the truth that would hurt in exactly the wrong place. This wasn't about supply theft, diverted medicine, or heating failures. I wrote about a hidden inheritance reserve, mismanaged legacy holdings, and old family money. It was the sort of scandal that makes thieves move fast, because greed trusts blood more than it trusts logistics. Thiago stood by the fire with both hands braced on the mantel, reading over my shoulder without getting in the way. The flames threw copper light over his face and carved the strain deeper around his mouth. "You hate this," I said. "I hate using you as bait." I kept writing. "Good. I'd be worried if you enjoyed it." His voice dropped lower. "That isn't a joke to me." That made my pen stop. I looked up and saw him watching me with that hard, steady focus that always felt like standing too near the edge of something high. Heat shifted through the room, from the fire, the storm, and him, and my own pulse answered before my head gave permission. This only works if they think we're split, I said. I know. But if Jaden believes you're exposed, he may move on you before he moves on the records. I set the pen down. Then don't let him. His jaw flexed once. Victoria. There it was, my name in that tone, low and rough and carrying far too much weight. I leaned back in the chair and folded my arms. You asked for proof, and this is how we get it. We tell the house I found something tied to your family line, which makes you angry and makes me look stubborn. We let the wrong people think we've stopped coordinating. The silence sat between us, heavy as wool. Then he pushed off the mantle and came around the table, not fast, but with a deliberate pace that was much worse. He stopped close enough that I could smell cedar and smoke under the clean heat of his skin, and my chair suddenly felt like a tactical error. And if I don't like the part where you look exposed, he asked, since when do you get to like the strategy? A shadow of a smile touched his mouth, but it didn't last. Since it puts you at risk. My brain was fully online, but my body was being much less useful. I picked up the report and held it out. Read. He took the pages, and his fingers brushed mine for half a second. It was barely there, but it was enough. The contact ran up my arm anyway, sharp and stupid. He scanned the summary, and his eyes narrowed at the line about concealed inheritance accounting. You're implying I knew. I'm implying enough to draw blood. His gaze lifted to mine. And after this, the house thinks you and I are no longer aligned. That's the point. He looked like he wanted to argue longer, but instead he gave one short nod. Then we make it convincing. We staged the fight in the library an hour later, with the doors open and the staff within earshot, keeping our voices pitched just right. He slapped the report onto the desk hard enough to rattle the inkwell. You overstep. I stood up just as hard. No, I read what your books say. You bring one theory into my house and act like a judge. And you keep confusing authority with insulation. That one landed. I saw the flinch under his control, and it was real enough to sting, which made it useful. He stepped in close with anger burning hot under his skin, and all that restrained force filled the room. Be careful. I tipped my chin up. Of what? The truth? No, he said, his voice low enough to vibrate in my chest. What it costs. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the report behind on purpose. Because the trap had teeth now, I knew the next move would not come for the accounts room. It would come for the sealed wing. The house finally took the bait just before the clock struck midnight. A maid who usually kept her eyes glued to the floor suddenly looked me right in the face, and a footman lingered a few seconds too long outside the west stairwell. When I doubled back through the portrait hall instead of heading to Thiago's suite, I caught the faint, rhythmic click of movement up ahead. It wasn't the sound of someone retreating. It was a signal. I found him waiting in the shadows, just past the chapel turn, leaning one shoulder against the cold stone as if he already knew I'd ignore his warnings. You're late, I whispered into the dark. His mouth twisted into a dry, humorless line. You disobey beautifully. Did anyone take the bait on the report? No, he admitted, but someone definitely searched my study. That was all the confirmation I needed to move. We headed toward the sealed corridor with a single lantern, 2 knives, and the kind of heavy silence that happens when 2 people stop pretending this is all just a theory. The wall panel I discovered the night before gave way under pressure once Thiago found the hidden release tucked inside the molding. Iron clicked, and old gears dragged against each other, opening a thin line through the wood that released a breath of air so cold and stale it felt like it had been buried for decades. The passage beyond smelled wrong from the very first step. It wasn't just the expected scent of dust, but a sharp mix of old antiseptic, damp paper, and rust. There was something medicinal hanging in the air, with a hint of sweet rot underneath it, like a memory of sickness trapped forever in the stone walls. My skin tightened as the atmosphere shifted. Thiago lifted the lantern higher to cut through the gloom. The swing was closed off long before I took control of the estate. That's not the same thing as saying you knew what was actually in here. His jaw flexed in the dim light. No, it isn't. We moved deeper into the dark. The corridor was narrow and reinforced much later than the rest of the house, which you could see in the heavy bolts and the ugly, practical stonework hidden behind the carved trim. Someone had taken an old service route and turned it into a containment space, and 3 doors now lined the left wall. 2 of them stood open to total darkness, but the third featured a warped brass plate that had turned half green with age. The word infirmary landed on me like a sheet of ice. Inside, the room opened up long and low, filled with rusted bed frames, drained cabinets, and broken privacy screens. A corroded sink sat in the corner near old restraints that were bolted to the wall and filed down badly, as if someone had felt a sudden, hurried sense of shame. My stomach turned at the sight of it. "Thiago," I breathed. He was already staring at the far shelves where the ledgers were kept. These weren't household accounts. They were clinical records, bound in gray hide and stacked tight beside archive boxes stamped with his family crest. He set the lantern down on a dusty surface and reached for one of the books, as if he expected it to bite him. I took the other stack, my gloves whispering over the brittle, yellowed paper. I saw names, ages, and bloodline notes, mixed with fertility projections and compatibility marks. These weren't medical files meant for healing, but selection and breeding logic dressed up to look like professional care. The air in the room shifted, becoming heavy and oppressive. "This is illegal," I said, my voice barely a whisper. His response came out rough and jagged. It was. I looked at him sharply. "You knew about this?" "No." The word hit hard and immediate. I knew my father was obsessed with our lineage, but I had no idea any of this existed. I believed him because horror has a specific smell that is cold, metallic, and hollowing. It was clinging to him now, cutting straight through his alpha control until I could finally see the boy who had inherited a throne before he ever inherited any real answers. Then I found the modern layer hidden beneath the history. I pulled out fresh payment chits tucked into an old archive sleeve and found current guard stamps alongside a new inventory strip. Present-day theft was moving through the veins of past cruelty, with one cover hidden inside another. "Look at this," I said. Thiago stepped close enough that his arm brushed mine as he read the documents, and the heat of his body met my cold skin in one sharp line of contact. They used this wing because they knew no one would ever audit it. No one would even dare to name it. He closed his eyes for a single beat and then opened them with a harder look. If this gets out the wrong way, the world will say I was the one protecting it. I looked at the records, the restraints, and the fresh stamps tucked among the old crimes. If it stays buried, someone is eventually going to do it again. The silence broke under a distant thud somewhere back inside the wall, and it wasn't the sound of the house settling. It was movement. We weren't going to be alone for much longer. Thiago straightened his posture, all his grief turning into something dangerous and predatory. "Take the payment chits and leave the rest of this for now. You're trusting me with your family's darkest secret." His gaze locked onto mine in the flickering lantern glow. "I'm trusting you to help me tell the story the right way." I gathered the proof with shaking hands, because some truths are too rotten to expose without care, and because protecting the context felt even more dangerous than protecting the man standing next to me. We managed to get 3 corridors away from the sealed wing before he stopped walking. He didn't just slow down. He made a hard pivot under a dead wall sconce, the lantern light cutting sharp angles over his face, while the old records breathed their rot into the air between us. I was moving so fast, I almost walked straight into the solid wall of his chest. "You held something back from me," he said. There it was. It wasn't a question or even anger at first, but a heavy impact that hung in the air. I kept the payment chits gripped in one hand and the copied notes in the other. I was just verifying the information. His stare dropped to the folded page I hadn't shown him earlier, which was a specific ledger variance buried under the family reserve marks. "How long have you had that?" "Since this afternoon." The silence that followed hit like a door slamming shut in a small room. I could hear the storm raging again now, a faint sound through the thick walls as the wind pushed against the old stone. Somewhere far below us, the pipes were ticking while the estate fought to keep its heat. The house was still alive and still bleeding, and suddenly the man in front of me looked less like an ally and more like the ruler of a place I had just chosen to protect from its own dark history. "You found a line tied directly to my family," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "And you decided I didn't need to know about it." I decided that one unverified anomaly in a house full of sabotage didn't justify blowing up the entire structure. His jaw flexed with suppressed tension. "That isn't your call to make." "It is if I'm the one actually reading the evidence." That landed badly, and I knew it. It felt good to say, but it also felt terrible. He stepped closer, all that heat and size and hard-won control pressing into the narrow hallway. "Do you even understand what this looks like? You accuse me when it fits your audit, but when something might actually hurt me, you decide to hide it." "I didn't hide it from you." "You withheld it." "Yes, I did," I snapped back. "Because records need context before men with power start reacting blindly to them." His eyes darkened at my words. Men with power. I let out a sharp, tired laugh. "Do you want me to pretend that phrase doesn't include you?" The air between us shifted irrevocably. This wasn't about the ledger line anymore, but about him asking for trust while standing inside walls built to keep ugly truths alive. It was about the fact that I wanted to believe he was different, and I hated myself for wanting it. He dragged a hand over his face and then the back of his neck, a nervous tell I had come to know too well. "I gave you full access to everything, and I used that access responsibly. By deciding exactly what I could handle, by making sure the evidence was real before I handed it to a man who was already carrying the weight of this entire house on his back." That stopped him in his tracks. For one beat, I saw the reality of it hit him. The exhaustion, the insult, and the part of him that heard the care in my voice, but still hated the method I used. When he finally spoke again, his voice was much quieter, which somehow made it feel worse. "You don't trust me." I met his gaze directly because lying to him now would be cheap. Not enough. He took that hit without flinching, and for some reason, that made it hurt even more. "Fair," he said. The word cut through me. I folded my arms across my chest, using them more as a shield than a posture. I came here to audit a failing estate, not to get folded into pack politics, bloodline horrors, and whatever this is. I waved a hand between us and regretted it immediately because the answer lived too close to my skin. I do systems. I like clean ones when I'm lucky, and I don't get soft in houses like this. Something moved in his expression then, but it was guarded rather than gone. He reached past me to open the library side door and then stepped back to let me through. "You'll have full access to the West records tonight." "That sounds very generous of you." "It's just practical." Right. Of course it was. He held my eyes for one last second. "Do not act alone again." That was a command my temperament was never built to honor, and we both probably knew it. Then he walked away, leaving me alone with the records, the proof, and the sharp new knowledge that closeness only gets dangerous the second it actually starts to matter. I did not obey, obviously. The second his footsteps faded into the hallway, I set the lantern on the long table and spread those ledgers back out. I went hunting for the one thing he was too angry to see. It wasn't that Thiago lacked the brain for it, but betrayal has a way of distorting scale. It makes every cut feel personal first and structural second, while my job was to do the exact reverse. So I started rebuilding the entire system from the bones up. I pulled patrol rosters, council visit logs, heating failures, and shipment gaps into one massive pile. I tracked archive access and emergency reroutes during the storm weeks until the paper itself started to feel warm under my hands. The library smelled like a mix of dust, leather, and lamp oil, with the last thin trace of his scent still caught in the doorframe. It was annoying, distracting, and completely impossible to ignore. Midnight dragged into something much later. Then the pattern finally locked. The theft spikes didn't happen during the storms like everyone assumed. They happened during council presence. I sat back hard against the chair. Every major loss matched a visit from Elder Mateo or one of his trade deputies, and every guard gap aligned perfectly with Jaden's signed patrol reassignments. Outer routes thinned out, while inner corridors got labeled for temporary reinforcement. Goods vanished exactly where eyes had been moved on purpose, proving this wasn't chaos, but a deliberate design. I marked the final line in wax pencil and stared at the web I'd uncovered. "Damn you," I said softly, though I wasn't entirely sure which one of them I was talking to. Because here was the shape of the trap at last. Mateo was bleeding the estate of money through tariff padding and false shortages, while Jaden was bleeding it of confidence through security failures. These gaps made Thiago look reactive instead of strong. One man was attacking the estate books, and the other was attacking the estate spine, which meant they weren't just stealing. They were preparing for a very public failure. The realization hit me like a physical cold front. They wanted a stage shortage in front of the full pack involving heat loss, ration panic, and medicine delays. One bad enough night would allow someone like Mateo to stand in the Great Hall and ask, with solemn concern, whether Thiago could still protect his own. This wasn't a coup that started with claws, but a political one that was cleaner, older, and much meaner. The storm pressed at the windows with a low, constant shove. I looked down at the chart again and felt something in me settle into a firm decision. I still wanted my fee and those clean exit papers that would get me off this mountain, which had been the plan from the very start. But sitting there in his library with the whole rotten pattern open under my hands, I knew my priorities had shifted in a way I hadn't given permission for. I wanted Thiago alive and in power, not because he paid well, but because the wrong men were already measuring the house for his absence. That was the part I didn't quite know what to do with yet. The silence broke under the sound of voices coming from beyond the west wall. They were low, male, and there was definitely more than one person out there. I killed the lamp wick down to a tiny glow and crossed over to the hidden service panel we'd used once before. The old passage carried sound clean through the stone if you knew exactly where to stand. I pressed my palm to the seam and listened. Mateo spoke first, his voice smooth and careful with a layer of false concern lacquered over his hunger. Then another elder chimed in, sharper than the first, pressing for a dawn assembly with full attendance. They wanted to ask questions about readiness, supply integrity, and leadership under the pressure of a prolonged storm. My blood went cold. They were moving right now. This wasn't happening next week or after more theft, but at dawn. I looked at the chart and Jaden's signatures, noting the route points and every ugly line that led to one conclusion. If I walked through the library door and into the war room like a guest, they would adjust their story before I could even get 3 sentences out. If I waited, Thiago would walk into their script completely blind. So I did the only reasonable thing left to do. I took the hidden passage through the walls. Because sometimes the cleanest route to the truth is the one built specifically for liars. The passage narrowed fast and forced me sideways through stone ribs that were slick with old damp. Dust coated my gloves, while the lantern I'd stolen from the library threw a mean little glow that caught bolts, pipe runs, and carved maintenance marks. Below me, the estate murmured through the walls as heat moved and water ticked. Voices rose and faded where corridors crossed, making it feel like I was crawling through the inside of a sleeping animal that was one bad cut away from waking up wrong. I followed the sound until I reached the war room. There was a grate above the east side that was half hidden behind a torn strip of insulation and old plaster. I dropped to one knee and looked through the opening. Thiago stood at the head of the table, with his broad shoulders squared and one hand flat on the wood. Council elders ringed him in dark coats with careful faces, while Jaden stood near the door, as still as a blade left on black cloth. No one looked even slightly rattled, which was the worst part of the whole scene. This had been planned enough times in private that the real thing almost looked routine. Mateo spoke first, his voice sounding as smooth as polished wrought. At dawn, the full pack will gather for storm rationing updates. Thiago didn't move an inch. As scheduled. Yes, Mateo said, folding his hands. But given the recent losses, concerns may be raised. By whom? A thinner elder answered this time, suggesting that any family with cold rooms or missing medicine would have questions about why a hired outsider now controlled the estate records. So that was part of the play. They wanted to use me as a form of contamination, to make the audit look like disruption instead of a diagnosis. Jaden finally spoke, and the sound of his voice slid under my skin like a cold draft. If the lower boilers fail during the assembly, panic will spread faster than facts, and guards will need to secure the armory, the nursery hall, and the west stores all at once. Thiago's head turned just a fraction. If? Jaden held his gaze without blinking. The heating grid is under a lot of strain. That was a lie. It wasn't fully a lie, which actually made it much better. The best sabotage always tells the truth right up to the point it kills you. Mateo stepped in before the silence could harden. A leader who cannot guarantee warmth and supply in winter invites doubt, and you know the old laws. There it was. It wasn't concern, but a process designed to dress a knife in policy and call it duty. Thiago's voice dropped low enough that it vibrated in my chest even through the metal grate. If any man in this room is threatening a challenge while my people are under storm lockdown, he is either a fool or a traitor. No one answered him. They didn't need to, because Jaden already had the next move ready to go. He unfolded a route strip and set it on the table, explaining that at the first bell, he would reassign the outer patrols to hall control. He claimed this would mean fewer moving parts and better containment. My stomach turned over. That was the final piece. They would strip the outer watch, lock the armory, and let the boilers fail to funnel fear inward. Then they would blame the audit, the shortages, and the outsider for the instability. Mateo would call the question while Jaden controlled the response, leaving Thiago pinned between public panic and a procedural challenge. The battle had a clear shape now, involving a dawn assembly, heat failure, and ration fear. It was a political execution by chaos. I backed away from the grate too fast and caught my shoulder on the stone. Pain flashed hot through my arm, but it didn't matter. Children were sleeping in the nursery wing, and elders were in the warm rooms above the south hall. If the boilers dropped in this weather, the pipes would crack before sunrise, and panic would do the rest of the work for them. I turned and ran through the passage blind. At the very next fork, a body stepped out of the dark. It was Jaden. Of course it was. He filled the narrow space without any hurry, his coat dark and his expression calm in a way that made the air feel thin. He looked from the lantern in my hand to the dust on my skirt, then finally back to my face. "Well," he said softly, "now the covert part is over." My brain finally rebooted, but my heart wasn't listening. Jaden took one step forward, and the whole passage seemed to change shape around him. Back in the war room, he knew how to play the part of the polished, loyal advisor. But down here, under the old stone and knocking heat pipes, he looked like what he actually was. He was big, controlled, and possessed a patient kind of cruelty that made my skin prickle. "You've been busy," I said, making sure to keep the lantern held high between us. His mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile as he looked me over. "And you've been reckless from the very first hour you stepped foot on this estate." That's funny, because I usually get that specific note from men who are already under investigation. He leaned one shoulder against the damp passage wall, like we were just discussing wine lists instead of a literal coup. "You think too small, Victoria, because theft is a small man's game, and this house needed the pressure to change." The lantern shook once in my hand, and I absolutely hated the fact that he saw it. "So it was you all along." "Me?" His brows lifted in mock surprise. "No, it's never just one man, and that's the primary weakness in your entire profession. Auditors are always hunting for a single signature, but the truth is that estates rot by committee." He stepped aside just enough to reveal the iron stair curling down into the darkness behind him. "Come on," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You've earned the rest." I knew I should have turned and run right then. Instead, I followed him down because he was finally talking, And men like Jaden only start telling the truth when they think they've already won the game. The boiler hall sat tucked under the south spine of the estate, a massive ribcage of iron, stone troughs, and sweating pipes. Heat should have lived in a place like this, but instead, the room felt fundamentally wrong, damp, and uneven. Steam feathered out from 2 open valves, and the pressure gauge over the main tank was trembling far too low for safety. Jaden closed the heavy door behind us with a soft, final click that echoed through the hall. "There," he said, spreading one hand toward the groaning machinery. "Your real audit." The scent hit me hard. Hot metal, heavy oil, and wet ash. Underneath all of that was the sharp electrical smell of systems being pushed way past their tolerance, and my architect brain took over before the fear could finish settling in my chest. I counted 3 pressure locks. There was one on the main feed, one on the west return, and a final one on the nursery branch override. If those 3 failed at the same time, the estate wouldn't just lose its heat. It would lose flow so fast, the pipes would likely burst. "You tampered with the boilers." "We simply corrected the balance," Jaden said, his tone dismissive. "Thiago inherited a famous name and thought that was enough to lead. But he leads with instinct and sentiment and that ridiculous need to protect everyone at once. Packs don't survive a hard winter on kindness." "No," I countered. "They survive on fuel, which is exactly what you stole." He ignored me entirely. "Mateo wanted leverage, but I wanted real change because the old bloodline rules kept this place in the hands of one family for far too long. Once we break the pack's confidence, the council will install a stewarded ruler, and this estate finally stops being a shrine to dead men." My skin went cold at the casual way he said it. "So that's your defense? You're going to bring about political reform by freezing children to death?" For the first time, something flashed in his face that wasn't calm, though it wasn't guilt either. It was pure contempt. "Collateral damage is temporary." The word made me feel physically sick. He moved closer, his massive frame looming over me. "And Thiago's softness toward you proved my point perfectly. A pack leader who gets distracted by one sharp little outsider is easy to provoke and even easier to expose." I laughed, because if I didn't, I was probably going to lunge at him with the lantern. "You actually built an entire coup around bookkeeping and some bitter feelings." "I built it around systems," he said, stepping into my space. "Something I honestly thought you'd respect." Then the air shifted. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a stripped key plate with 3 tagged lock numbers hanging from the ring. "If these pressure locks are not manually reset before the sun comes up," he said, "the entire grid fails during the assembly. Panic starts, Mateo takes the hall, I take over security, and Thiago loses the pack forever." He'd said enough. Maybe he'd said way too much, because the very second his attention flicked toward the gauge, I slammed the heavy lantern into the release wheel right beside me. The glass burst into 1,000 shards, and steam screamed out in a blinding white blast that filled the room. Jaden swore loudly and lunged for me blind, but I ducked under his reaching arm, grabbed the tagged key strip from his hand, and bolted for the exit. The corridor beyond was already half flooded with hot water over the stone, and the steam was thick enough to blind a person. My boots slipped hard on the wet floor, but I caught the wall and kept moving while my lungs burned and my heart tore at my ribs. Behind me, his voice cracked through the white haze like a whip. "Victoria!" I didn't look back once. I had the confession, I had the mechanism, and I had exactly 1 man left to reach before the dawn killed every one of us. I found him waiting in the war room. He wasn't at the table or shouting orders. He was just standing there, with both hands braced on the map chest. His head was down and his shoulders were rigid, looking like the whole estate was balanced on his spine, and 1 more ounce of pressure might break him. The room smelled like banked fire, wet wool, iron, and that deep male heat of cedar and smoke that always made the air feel smaller. I hit the doorway hard enough that the wood slammed against the stone wall. He looked up fast, his eyes locking onto mine. I must have been a total wreck, standing there with my coat soaked through and my hair half loose. Steam was still curling off my clothes in the cold draft from the hall, and while my lungs felt flayed raw, my hands still clutched that key strip so tight the metal teeth bit into my palm. "Jaden," I choked out. The boiler hall. Mateo's in it with him, and the dawn assembly is the play. Thiago crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't go for the papers or the maps. He came straight to me. His hands landed on my arms, then moved to my shoulders and my face, checking me over with a rough, fast desperation for blood or breaks. His thumb dragged under my jaw, and his eyes went hot and lethal when he caught the red welt rising where Jaden had shoved me into the steam. What did he do to you? I'm fine, Thiago. That is not an answer. It's the only one you're getting before the sun comes up. I shoved the key strip into his hand and pressed the soaked root notes after it. There are 3 manual pressure locks on the main feed, the west return, and the nursery branch. If they aren't reset before the assembly, the heat grid fails in front of the full pack, and that's when the panic starts. Mateo will call for a challenge while Jaden seals the armory and blames the whole thing on the audit. He read the notes once and understood the entire situation, and I watched the cold shape of war settle behind his eyes. Then I said the part that actually hurt to admit. I should have told you sooner. His gaze snapped back to mine instantly. The ledger line, I said, my voice shaking. The family anomaly. I was busy verifying it, but I still should have put it in your hand before we went to the sealed wing or any of this happened. The silence that followed was absolute, falling over us like a heavy blanket. Then he reached out and pulled me into him. It wasn't a soft or tentative gesture. It was a hard, fierce hold that hit me like a physical impact. My forehead knocked against his collarbone, and his arms locked around my back to hold me there like he was trying to ground both of us by sheer force. Relief flooded through me so fast it made my knees go weak in his grip. His mouth brushed my temple, and his voice was low and rough. We can do guilt later. I let out one long, shaking breath against his chest. That is definitely not a move for forgiveness. No, he said, his chest vibrating against mine. It's triage. I laughed once, feeling tired and wrecked and way too close to crying again. That's almost romantic in a twisted way. Don't ruin the moment, Victoria. He let me go just enough to look at me, and I noticed blood darkening one of his knuckles. There was a fresh split at his lip I hadn't seen before, and the sight of it made something ugly and protective twist low in my gut. What happened here while I was gone? Council pressure, he said shortly. Nothing they can't survive. How comforting. His hand found the back of my neck for one warm, grounding second before he turned away. He started barking for maps, runners, and engineering keys, and the wolves moved at once as the room snapped awake around us. He pointed a finger at the lower estate sketch. I'll hold the assembly and keep Mateo talking as long as I can. I stepped up beside him. I'm taking the boilers. His head turned sharply toward me. Absolutely not alone. Then assign me bodies who can actually follow directions and not try to improvise heroically. A shadow of heat moved in his eyes. Are you seriously giving orders in my war room now? Yes, I am. He almost smiled at that, and for a second, the tension broke. Good. I laid out the route as fast as I could, pointing out the service passage to the South Hall drop and setting up kitchen runners for message relay. We planned to move the nursery toward the inner warm rooms if the first lock lagged, and we'd release the forged report and the real theft proofs together if Mateo pushed for a public challenge. Thiago listened to every word, adjusting the plan and adding teeth where I had added the structure. We were equals under pressure now, with no room left for performance or secrets. When we were finally done, he looked at me in a way that made the whole storm-dark room fall away into nothing. Stay where I can reach you. I met his gaze and said the truest thing I had left in me. Then win me the time I need. And because the dawn was already climbing the side of the mountain, we went to war. Dawn arrived gray and mean. The great hall filled up long before the light did, with wet boots stamping meltwater into the ancient stone and heavy cloaks steaming near the braziers. Voices stayed low, but nobody was calm, and you could actually feel the questions moving through the room like cold air whistling through cracked glass. Families from the upper terraces stood beside workers from the stores, and elders wrapped in wool and suspicion. Everyone had heard enough to know something was wrong, but they didn't know enough to understand where to put their fear. Thiago stood at the front, beneath the carved beam of his house crest, wearing a black coat and a hard posture that matched his dangerous stillness. He always got quiet like that when his fury had nowhere safe to go, and the sight of him really should have steadied the room. It almost did. I stayed below him in the lower service route behind the hall walls, moving fast with 2 engineers and a kitchen runner who looked 17 and terrified. The stone steps were slick with condensation while the heat pipes knocked overhead, and the key strip Jaden dropped into my hand felt sharp through my glove. It was almost like the estate itself was biting me just to stay awake. Above us, the hall doors boomed shut. The assembly had started. The first voice to carry down through the floor grates belonged to Mateo, and it was smooth, sorrowful, and false enough to curdle milk. "My pack," he said, and I could hear the way he was trying to wrap his influence around the room. "We gather under strain because supplies are lost and records are unsettled, while the storm pressure keeps mounting. We ask only what any loyal family would ask, which is simply to know if we are safe." The answer came from Thiago, and his voice was low and iron-heavy. Yes. It was simple and good, but it wasn't nearly enough for a man like Mateo. I reached the first pressure lock at the main feed, which was just an old brass wheel with a manual release. Rust crusted the seams where someone clearly wanted any delay to look like simple neglect, so I shoved my shoulder into it, but the metal held firm. "Tool," I snapped. One engineer handed me the hook wrench, so I braced my boots on the wet stone and pulled until the wheel screamed. Metal bit into my palms right through the gloves, and behind my ribs, my heart kept an ugly, frantic time. Above me, Mateo spoke again. "Then why has your estate bled goods for weeks? And why are there armed men in the halls before sunrise? Why does an outsider hold the books while your own people are freezing?" There it was, the moment he inserted me clean into the wound. Thiago did not rise to the bait. Because the theft came from inside my walls, and I intend to name exactly who did it. The hall shifted, and I could hear the change in the murmur as surprise and fear mixed with a little bit of hope. It was hard to tell for sure from under the stone, but the wheel finally gave a quarter turn before it stopped dead. "Come on," I muttered. Steam hissed from a pipe seam over my head, sending hot droplets onto my cheek, while the engineer beside me swore under his breath. Pressure was dropping faster than we predicted, and I could feel the line vibration getting too weak and far too thin. Above us, I heard the sound of chairs scraping. A new voice spoke up, belonging to a thin elder. "Your intent is not the question here, because your control is what matters." I dragged the wrench harder until pain shot up my forearm, and the wheel moved another notch as a pipe somewhere far off in the estate knocked back to life. It wasn't enough. The kitchen runner stumbled down the steps with his breath sawing in his chest. "The nursery hall is cooling down fast, and the women are already moving blankets in," he said. My stomach turned. Mateo had picked his moment perfectly by keeping the room listening while the house began to fail around them. He wanted to make the fear visible and force Thiago to answer for it in public, while I fought iron in the walls like an idiot with a deadline. Then Thiago's voice dropped through the grate again, sounding bigger now and carrying to every corner of the room. "You want the truth?" Thiago said. "Good, because you're going to have it." The room went dead quiet. I got the first lock open with a violent wrench that nearly threw me backward, and pressure slammed through the feed line with a deep metallic shudder. The response came too slow, though, and it was far too slow to help. Above me, even as the first bit of heat began crawling back into the lower pipes, I heard the pack start to murmur in real fear. The estate was losing warmth much faster than I had warned them it would. Cold moved faster than the truth. I felt it in the pipes first, because even though the main feed kicked alive under my hands, the line above me still shivered thin and weak. It felt like blood trying to reach numb fingers, and then the runner's teeth started chattering in the middle of his sentence, which told me everything I needed to know. "We're behind," I said. "No kidding," one engineer muttered, his breath fogging white in the air. The corridor had gone sharp with the smell of wet stone, steam, and iron, and now that clean, brutal winter scent was pushing in where the heat should have been. Somewhere overhead, a pipe cracked with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The estate was starting to freeze. I grabbed the root chalk from my pocket and dropped to one knee by the service wall. Listen to me, because we have to stop trying to save comfort and start saving bodies. Both engineers leaned in close. Shut the west guest loop entirely and divert what's left to the nursery, the infirmary corridor, and the inner family hall. Open the old servant vents on level 2, because even though they're ugly, they carry heat better than the decorative runs. The older engineer blinked at me. Those haven't been used in years. Then today is the day they get a comeback. He didn't argue. He just went. I sent the younger one toward the nursery branch with a tool satchel and orders to keep the valve room clear of any panicked staff. Then I tore through the lower passage toward the service stair, with my boots splashing through melt and boiler runoff while my lungs started to burn. Above us, the great hall had gone loud. It wasn't the sound of a riot, but it was something worse, because it was the sound of human fear trying to stay polite. As I climbed, I caught pieces of the conversation through the grates. The children are cold in the east wing. The south room's just lost all pressure. Where is the security team? And over all of it, I heard Thiago. You will not stampede your own people, he said, and his voice hit the room with the force of a slammed door. It bought me a few seconds, but maybe less. I burst into the cross corridor outside the nursery hall and nearly collided with 3 kitchen women who were carrying armfuls of quilts. It was a relief to see that someone in this house actually knew how to survive. This way, I said, pointing them toward the inner family rooms. Forget the West Wing. Just keep everyone moving and shut the doors behind you, because we need warm bodies in small spaces. One woman stopped and stared at me. Who gave that order? I did. She took one look at my face and nodded, like that was all the proof she needed. It was a good choice. The branch valve room was colder than the corridor, which really should have been impossible. Frost feathered the edge of the iron casing, and my fingers went numb the second I grabbed the wheel. But it didn't move at all. Come on, I hissed. Nothing happened. Then the message runner skidded into the room with his cheeks red and his chest heaving. The hall, he gasped. Mateo is calling for a vote, and he says the pack can't wait while the house fails. Of course he was doing that. One problem closes and a bigger one opens immediately. The heat route was shifting, but the political route was collapsing even faster. I dug in my coat pocket for the folded kitchen chit I'd shoved there hours ago, which was the one Thiago and I joked about after the coffee scene. Apparently, even in a collapsing estate, we still had time for bad humor, so I grabbed the runner's sleeve. Take this to Thiago and say one word only. He nodded fast. Bitter. His eyes flicked down to the note and then back to me. That's it? That's it. Now go. He ran off. The code was simple because bitter meant he needed to move now, without any debate or explanation. He had to trust the warning and come to me. I turned back to the wheel and planted both of my boots against the wall brace. My gloves slipped on the cold metal, so I tore one off with my teeth and gripped the bare iron. Pain shot through my palm, but I'd take pain over delay any day. Above me, through the stone and the timber and the failing heat, the atmosphere in the hall changed. It didn't get louder. It got hollower. It was the sound of a room realizing its leader had just made an impossible choice. If Thiago came to me now, to the sealed branch and the failing lock and the freezing children beyond it, he would be leaving the assembly at the exact moment Mateo wanted him pinned in place. I hauled the wheel with everything I had left, and somewhere overhead, my pack leader chose us anyway. He finally showed up. I heard the shift in the atmosphere before I actually saw him, the sound of heavy boots hitting stone with a fast, certain rhythm that didn't match the panicked scurrying of the staff. Then the steel latch gave way as the sealed branch door tore open, and Thiago filled the entire frame with cold clinging to his coat and a look of pure fury on his face. For 1 second, the relief hit me so hard I thought my knees might actually fold under me. You left the hall, I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. He stepped into the small room and immediately drove his shoulder into the frozen release lever right beside me. You sent for me, he answered. That ridiculous coffee code we'd joked about landed between us like a live wire, carrying all the meaning we hadn't said out loud. Bitter meant move now, and he had trusted me enough to drop everything and run. The lever moved maybe half an inch, but it wasn't nearly enough to clear the line. Again, I snapped, watching him brace himself against the wall. He didn't argue or ask questions. He just widened his stance as the muscles bunched under his black wool coat, and his breath came out in thick clouds of steam. The scent of him hit me through the frost and the metallic tang of the room, a heavy mix of cedar wood, cold rain, and that deep animal heat that always felt impossible in the middle of winter. He shoved against the iron with everything he had until the metal finally shrieked in protest. The branch lock broke free with a crack that echoed off the stone. Heat slammed through the pipe with a violent thud that shook the very foundation of the wall. And somewhere deep in the house, the line woke up and started to run. It wasn't a smooth or pretty sound, but the system was finally alive. I grabbed the side valve and spun it open, while Thiago used his weight to hold the lever down. The room changed instantly as steam surged around us and my numb fingers started to sting from the sudden warmth. The silence broke under the heavy groan of old iron and the sharp rush of saved pressure finally moving toward the nursery wing. Then the air shifted in a way I hadn't expected. A panel at the back of the valve room, one I'd noticed during my first structural pass of the building, sat slightly ajar from the force of the pressure jolt. Behind that panel was a narrow vault shelf built directly into the old infirmary wall, looking hidden and dry and very deliberate. I reached out and pulled it open. Inside the small space sat 3 ledgers wrapped in thick oilcloth, a packet of stamped route chits, and 1 sealed record tube marked clearly with Thiago's family crest. He saw that crest and went completely still. I looked at the date on the top ledger and felt my stomach drop, because it placed these records right in the middle of his father's reign. I opened the tube first and found a signed directive authorizing lineage testing under the cover of infirmary quarantine, written in cold legal language that made the cruelty sound like simple paperwork. There was no sign of panic or shame in the writing, just official signatures and a casual permission to destroy lives. Thiago took the page from my hand, his fingers brushing mine for a second. His face didn't change much, which was actually the worst part, because I could tell the impact had gone inward. His jaw locked tight and his throat moved once as he swallowed, and the silence around him grew heavier and older, as if his grief had actual physical mass. Then I opened the top ledger and realized this wasn't just ancient history. These were current stockpile routes, heating diversions, and emergency reserves that had been kept entirely off the books. Mateo had been hiding enough fuel and medicine to keep the people in a state of constant fear, while he pretended there was a scarcity. It was old abuse in one hand and brand new theft in the other. "We can bury this right now," I said quietly, looking up at him. "Or we can survive it." His eyes lifted to mine, looking dark and steady and burned raw by what he was seeing. "If I release this without any context, I'll destroy whatever trust is left in this family. And if you hide it, you just become the wall that kept it all secret." The words stayed between us, feeling hard and clean in the cramped space. Outside, muffled by the thick stone walls, the great hall roared with the sound of a room full of people who were finally losing their patience. Thiago looked down at the directive again, staring at his father's name before looking at the ledger still gripped in my hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that I could feel it vibrate in my chest. "The truth, but with the context." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "Then we do it together." He reached for me without thinking, his hand catching my jaw with fingers that were still cold from the hall. His thumb was rough against my skin, and I realized this wasn't a performance or a strategy. It was just relief and fear and something too big to name pressing breath close in a room full of steam. His mouth found mine hard and fast, tasting of smoke and cold and pure adrenaline. The kiss hit me like the feeling of surviving a wreck, a clean collision after way too much restraint and months of holding back. It was all held heat and shaking breath and the brutal relief of not being alone in the worst room in the house. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine for one long beat. Then the estate groaned again as the pipes settled. One final lock remained to be cleared. And I knew that in the outer boiler tower, Jaden would be waiting for us to finish this. We ran for the outer tower through sleet that felt like someone was throwing handfuls of nails at our faces. The yard lamps were half dead, casting a smeared gold light across the ice and the black stone of the courtyard. Wind tore at my coat as I struggled for footing, but Thiago stayed right at my back for the first stretch. He kept one hand flat between my shoulders whenever the path got slick under my boots, and the contact didn't feel gentle at all. It felt like a command to keep moving and stay alive. The tower stairs rose out of the storm in a jagged spiral of iron and frost. One look at the structure told me exactly what Jaden had done to the place. The upper catwalk braces had been loosened just enough that they wouldn't fail in calm weather, but they were guaranteed to shake loose under the weight of a struggle. Of course he did this, I muttered, squinting against the wind. Thiago's mouth hardened into a thin line. He wants height, he wants the cold, and he wants witnesses. He doesn't just want to win, he wants a story. We started the climb. The metal rang under our feet with a thin, ugly sound that made my skin crawl. Wind screamed through the open struts of the tower, and by the time we hit the top platform, my fingers were numb and my lungs felt like they'd been carved out by the cold. The pressure gauge on the outer tank was jerking near the red line, sending white bursts of steam feathered from the side vents. One more delay was all it would take for the whole line to rupture and take the tower with it. Jaden was standing right between us and the final release wheel. He wasn't wearing a coat anymore, just a dark shirt soaked through at the throat, with his sleeves shoved high to reveal forearms roped with wet, corded strength. Snow melted on his skin and ran along muscles that were tight with strain, making him look less polished and more honest than I'd ever seen him. "I was wondering which one of you would actually get here first," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. Thiago stepped ahead of me, his body shielding me from the worst of the gusts. "Move." Jaden's gaze slid past him to find me. "You really should have just taken the fee and left when you had the chance." "It was tempting," I admitted. "But then, who would be here to ruin your night?" The tower shuddered under a fresh gust of wind that made the iron shriek. The release wheel sat 10 feet behind Jaden, half covered in a thick rim of ice, with only one narrow catwalk leading to it over the drop to the boiler throat below. Thiago saw the same thing I did and whispered my name. "Victoria." "I know the plan," I replied. Jaden smiled then, a small and dead expression that didn't reach his eyes. "He goes for me, and you make a run for the wheel. You're a structural thinker, which makes you very predictable." He moved first, lunging forward with a speed that caught me off guard. Thiago met him hard, and the impact of the two of them slamming together was so violent that the catwalk bucked under my boots. Jaden fought like a man who had planned out every single angle, but still liked the physical part of the fight best. He used his elbows, his shoulders, and his knees in short, savage strikes, while Thiago hit back with a raw force and fury that finally had somewhere to go. I took the opening and ran low along the side rail. The catwalk groaned under the shifting weight, and I could see that one brace on the left had already split its bolts. It was a terrible situation, but I realized it might actually be useful if I timed things right. Jaden saw what I was doing and twisted free just long enough to drive Thiago back into the rail. Iron screamed under the pressure, so I dropped to one knee by the support joint and yanked the maintenance pin I'd spotted on the way in. Rust tore under my glove as I pulled, and the brace slipped half an inch with a sickening jolt. "Thiago, get down!" I yelled. He trusted me without a second of hesitation. That trust was the only reason this worked. He dropped flat to the metal just as I kicked the loosened strut with everything I had. The catwalk lurched sideways, and Jaden lost his balance for one clean second as his boots skidded on the sleet. It was the only opening we were going to get. Thiago hit him like a battering ram, and both of them crashed into the far rail with a sound that made me wince. I didn't wait to see who landed on top. I just crawled for the wheel. The metal was so cold, it felt like it was shredding the skin on my palms. I wrapped both hands around the rim and pulled, but it didn't budge. Behind me, I heard the sound of fists thudding into flesh, followed by a grunt and a curse. Then Jaden's voice came through the storm, sounding blood-thick and wild. "He protects the rot and has the nerve to call it honor." I pulled harder, ignoring the pain in my shoulders. The wheel moved a fraction of an inch, and a blast of steam from the side vent burned across my wrist, but I didn't let go. Thiago let out a roar of effort. I looked back once, which I immediately realized was a bad idea. Jaden had managed to pull a knife, and Thiago's hand was locked onto his wrist as both men slipped dangerously near the edge. Snow and blood were mixing into a dark stain on the iron, and the whole tower was shaking under the pressure building directly below us. So I stopped looking and focused on the task. I planted my boots firmly on the vibrating metal and hauled on the wheel with everything I had left in me. The wheel turned once, then twice, and then it spun all the way to the stop. Deep inside the tower, the lock released with a thunderous metallic slam that I felt in my teeth. Heat surged through the line as the gauge finally dropped out of the red. Jaden froze just long enough to realize he'd lost, and the fight seemed to drain out of him as the steam hissed into the night. By the time we made it back to the Great Hall, the heat had beaten us there. It wasn't a full summer warmth yet, and it certainly wasn't comfortable, but it was enough to stop our breath from blooming into thick white clouds. People felt the shift in the air and looked up from their huddles, which mattered more than any speech, because timing is everything when fear has already taken root. Thiago walked into the light with blood smeared across one knuckle and sleet melting off his heavy coat, carrying the kind of silence that reminds a room exactly who built it. I kept pace beside him, with the ledgers tucked under my arm, my gloves blackened by grease and grit from the tower, while my pulse continued to punch against my ribs from the frantic climb down. Mateo was positioned near the center aisle, flanked by elders who suddenly looked very interested in being anywhere else, now that the pipes had started to sing with steam. Jaden was nowhere to be seen. Nobody asked where he was. Thiago didn't head for his seat, instead stopping right in front of the assembly to let the room settle and go quiet around him. Pack members stood shoulder to shoulder in their damp wool coats, children hid behind skirts, and the kitchen staff watched with red, chapped hands while the guards tried to look indifferent and failed. The entire estate smelled like wet stone, rising steam, and cold fur, mixed with the scent of a panic that was just starting to lose its grip. Mateo tried to speak first, because, of course he did. "My lord, this is exactly why the council requested—" Thiago cut him off without even raising his voice, simply stating that they had requested a failure. That hit the mark perfectly. A ripple moved through the crowd, and it wasn't loud, but it was focused in a way that felt much more dangerous. I stepped forward before Mateo could start spinning more words into a shield and announced that the audit was finally complete. I explained that the supply shortages were manufactured through false routing, padded tariffs, and redirected patrols, with hidden reserves kept off the books during the height of the storm season. I opened the first ledger on the long wooden table, and the dry pages cracked loudly under my hand. Fuel diversions, medicine delays, and duplicate approvals were all part of it, along with guard reassignments signed through security channels to create deliberate blind spots, I said, as I turned another page. This wasn't just a case of bad management, it was calculated sabotage. Mateo found his nerve for one last attempt, claiming it was the work of an outsider who had destabilized the estate from the moment she arrived. I looked him straight in the eye and told him it was a good attempt, but unfortunately for him, the paper remembered the truth better than he could lie. A few people let out sharp, mean laughs that broke the spell he was trying to cast over the room. Thiago placed the old directive on the table right next to the fresh ledgers, and he didn't soften his expression when he spoke because that was the entire point. "There is more," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "There is a rot in this house that is older than this theft, hidden under my family name and my father's rule." The room went so still that I could actually hear the water dripping from someone's hem onto the stone floor. He put one hand on the document as if it weighed 100 pounds and spoke about illegal bloodline testing, inheritance paranoia, and cruelty that people tried to dress up as duty. His jaw tightened just once as he admitted it happened right here, before his time, and that some men in the room had used those buried crimes as a cover to commit their own. There was no hero voice and no polished distance, just the raw truth with the skin still on it. I took over the explanation before the silence could turn into total disbelief. I told them these records were hidden in the sealed infirmary wing, along with the current theft routes, proving that past abuses had become the foundation for the present. Systems survive not because monsters are rare, but because they are organized and efficient. Mateo opened his mouth to argue, but the estate chose that exact moment to breathe. Heat pushed through the upper vents in one deep mechanical rush, causing the braziers to flare brighter and a child near the side aisle to laugh in surprise. Then a voice called out from the back of the hall, simply saying that their room was finally warm. That was the turning point. It wasn't about drama, it was about proof. The mood in the room shifted as heads angled toward Mateo, with a look that was much colder than fear. It was recognition. Thiago looked at every face in the crowd and did the one thing I really didn't expect him to do. He didn't ask them to see him as an innocent man. "I inherited this house, which means I inherited all of its debts, whether they have names or not," he said firmly. "I have no intention of burying either of them." It was the right thing to say, which usually means it's the most dangerous path to take. Standing there with the ledgers open and the heat returning to the stones, I watched Thiago refuse the easy version of himself and knew we had settled the question of who was bleeding the estate dry. What we hadn't settled was what this truth would cost us once the storm finally cleared. By noon, the mountain had finally stopped its attempt to swallow the estate whole. The storm wasn't gone, as it still hung over the peaks in low gray bands with snowmelt dripping from the gutters, but the panic had broken along with the clouds. The house no longer felt like it was clenching its teeth, and the staff were crossing the halls without flinching at every shadow. Kitchen smoke rose in clean lines from the west stacks, and somewhere in the south corridor, a child's laugh bounced off the vaulted ceiling so loudly that two maids actually grinned at each other. I walked the lower floors by myself on purpose. I checked the boiler hall first, then the nursery wing, and finally the sealed infirmary corridor, where guards were now carrying record boxes instead of drawn weapons. The estate smelled different in the daylight after a crisis, filled with the scent of wet wool, soap, and fresh bread. The relief of survival has a very specific scent, and it's never particularly pretty, but it is always human. My work was visible everywhere I looked. Corrected route ledgers were stacked in the steward's office, and emergency reserves were logged and tagged for everyone to see. I ran my fingers over a page where old false vendor codes had been crossed out in thick black ink, and felt a small, private pulse of pride. I had come here just for a fee, but I had ended up changing the very way this house breathed. That was exactly why I needed to pack my bags and leave before I started mistaking my usefulness for actual safety. So I started packing. My room had been repaired while the estate was busy fighting for its life, and the hearth was burning clean once again. My suitcase sat open across the bed, half full of folded sweaters and the gloves I had nearly ruined in the boiler room, and I was rolling my tools into their leather wrap when a single knock hit the doorframe. Thiago was standing there holding a tray. Of course he was. It wasn't a ceremonial thing with silver domes, just 2 mugs, a small pot, and a bowl of berries, like he had personally convinced the kitchen to pretend everything was normal. "I can still leave if this is some kind of house custom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It isn't," he replied. He stepped into the room and set the tray on the table by the window, appearing tired in a way that made him look more dangerous rather than less. His coat was gone, and his dark shirt was open at the throat, with his hair still damp from a quick wash, as if the control he exerted cost him something physical. "I brought your payment," he said, pointing to an envelope on the tray. He added that there was a car waiting at the front steps, and I could have a driver or not, depending on what I wanted. There was no command in his voice, and no pressure, just a plain sense of respect that almost undid me more than the actual war had. I crossed the room slowly and stopped by the tray, telling him he was making this very easy for me. His gaze held mine as he said he was just trying to make it honest. The coffee smelled warm and rich, without that burnt scent for once, so I picked up the mug and took a cautious sip. I actually blinked in surprise. It wasn't just drinkable, it was actually good, with a deep roast and a bit of spice that didn't have an acrid bite at the end. I looked up at him over the rim of the mug and realized he had fixed it. One corner of his mouth moved as he told me he had simply listened. The room went quiet after that. Outside, the meltwater ticked from the roof in a slow, bright rhythm, while the heat from the hearth gathered at my back. He stood 3 feet away without claiming the space or crowding me, refusing to use the heavy, beautiful weight of his presence to force the moment into what he wanted. That made everything much worse. When a man like Thiago stops giving orders and starts asking questions, there is nowhere left to hide except the truth. He didn't move an inch, keeping his hands loose at his sides, as if he realized one wrong step would send me bolting straight for the heavy oak door. The silence between us stretched, thick and pressurized, until he finally broke it with a voice that sounded like gravel over velvet. "I can offer you a contract," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. I just stared at him, my fingers curling tighter around the ceramic of my mug while the steam dampened my skin. Then he shook his head, a sharp, frustrated motion that dismissed his own words before I even had a chance to process them. "No, that's not true, and I'm done lying to both of us about why you're still standing in this room. I can offer you 10 contracts, rebuild oversight, and the power to restructure every supply route this mountain has ignored for a decade. I could give you the authority to tear the council's old, rotting systems out by the roots until no one here would ever dare to question your word again." His mouth tightened into a hard, grim line as he looked at me. But that's still just business, and I am exhausted from using ledgers and logistics to stand in for what I actually mean. The air in the room shifted, turning heavy and electric, the way it feels right before a lightning strike hits the peak. My grip tightened on the mug until the heat soaked deep into my palms, grounding me against the sudden pull of his gravity. Outside the window, a heavy shelf of snow finally lost its hold on the roofline, sliding off with a soft, muffled rush that felt like a long-held breath being released. Thiago looked at me then, and I realized the truth was a blade he had already decided to fall on, regardless of the cost. "I want your mind in my war room every single morning," he said, his voice dropping an octave until it was a low, subterranean rumble. "I want your mouth telling me exactly when I'm wrong, and I want your eyes on every weak beam in this house before the wood starts to crack. I want the part of you that walks into a room full of rot and names it without blinking. And I want the woman who refuses to bend just because a man is large enough to block her exit." I exhaled, a slow and shaky sound, because that particular confession landed right where my armor used to live. He took one step closer, and the scent of him hit me. Sharp cedarwood, clean skin, and the ghost of wood smoke caught deep in the fibers of his dark coat. "And I want you," he said, the words vibrating in my chest like a physical weight I wasn't prepared to carry. "Not because of the storm outside, and not because you saved this estate from its own greed. Not because fate or blood or the pack would find it convenient for the alpha to have a mate like you. I want you because when this entire house was coming apart at the seams, you were the only clear thing left in it." My throat went tight, the kind of ache that comes when you realize you've run out of places to hide. That was the problem with honest men, especially the ones who looked like they were carved out of the mountain itself. You couldn't dodge them with sarcasm forever, and you couldn't pretend their heartbeat didn't match the rhythm of your own. I set the mug down on the table before my hands started shaking enough to drop it. "Thiago." "I know." His eyes stayed locked on mine, dark and steady. "You don't want a cage, even if it's dressed up as devotion." "No," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "I don't." I moved then, taking one slow, deliberate step until the space between us felt charged enough to hum against my skin. He was too warm and far too close, a massive landscape of corded muscle and quiet intensity that made my pulse skip like it had never learned a single lesson in its life. "I won't stay," I told him, "if this just becomes gratitude with nicer furniture and a title I didn't earn." "It won't." "What if I say no to you in front of your entire pack, right in the middle of the Great Hall?" "Then you'll still be right to do it, and I'll be the one who has to listen." And if I tear apart your ledgers, overrule your stewards, and tell you to your face that your coffee tastes like a punishment? That finally pulled the smallest, most genuine smile from him, a flash of warmth that softened the hard planes of his face. Then I suppose I'll have to buy better beans. I hated how much I loved that answer, and I hated how the relief of surrender was starting to feel better than the tension of the fight. So I told him the last true thing I had left. I want something real, Thiago. Not a role to play, and not a symbol for your people to rally around. I don't want a pretty place to stand while men talk over me. If I stay because I choose the work, and because I choose you. Those are not the same thing, and I need you to understand that. His gaze went dark and unwavering. I know. And maybe that was the whole point. Not some grand, fated collapse into each other's arms, but something much more dangerous. He knew the difference between the woman and the worker, and he wanted both of them anyway. I reached for the collar of his shirt first. His breath caught, a tiny, jagged hitch in his chest that I felt more than I heard. Then his hand came to my waist, firm and radiating heat through my clothes, not dragging me in, but just staying there, waiting to see if I would close the final inch myself. I did. The kiss was slower this time, lacking the frantic energy of the sleet and the crisis pounding at the walls. There was just the hearth crackling behind me, the cold mountain light at the window, and his mouth on mine, like he had all the patience in the world and nowhere else to be. It deepened on the second breath, his thumb pressing into my side to anchor me, while my hand slid up into the damp weight of his hair. Relief moved through me so sharp it almost hurt, a physical release of the pressure that had been building since I first stepped onto this mountain. When we finally broke apart, my forehead rested against his, our breathing tangled in the quiet room. I'll stay through the winter, I whispered against his skin. For the rebuild. His hand tightened once at my waist, a possessive, grounding pressure. And after the winter? I looked at the open case on the bed, the ledgers scattered on the table, and the mountain looming beyond the glass. Then I looked at the man in front of me, who had finally learned how to ask for what he needed instead of just taking it. After winter, I said, we find out what survives the truth. The boilers held through the coldest nights of the season. The ledgers did not lie, no matter how much the council wished they would. And the mountain, for one more winter, stayed standing against the weight of the world. I spent my first week of staying exactly where I said I would, buried in the records room and the lower stores where old habits still clung to the stone like moss. The staff stopped shrinking away when I asked questions, and the runners started bringing me reports before I even had to demand them. The women in the kitchen even started slipping me fresh rolls, as if I'd passed some secret test no council member could ever understand. The estate was changing, and while it was slow and uneven, it finally felt real. So was he. Thiago still moved like a storm given bones, filling every doorway as if the house had been built specifically to contain him. But now he knocked before entering, and he asked for my opinion instead of issuing commands. Sometimes he did it badly, because men raised inside that kind of power rarely learn gentleness on the first try. But he tried, and that mattered more than any amount of polish. The first morning after I chose to stay, he brought me coffee again. I looked at the mug, then up at the man holding it. If this is terrible, I'm leaving before the snow melts. His mouth twitched. Fair. I took a sip. It was warm spice and a dark, rich roast with no bitter ash hiding behind bad judgment. I hummed low in my throat, and the relief that crossed his face was so quick and quiet, it hit me harder than any flattery ever could. Better, I said. He stepped close enough that his heat pressed through the chill of the room, one hand braced on the desk while the other wrapped around the back of my chair. So you're staying? For the audit rebuild, I reminded him, though my heart wasn't really in the lie anymore. His eyes dropped to my mouth and then back up to mine. That wasn't the question. No, it wasn't. I leaned back just enough to look at him properly, taking in the hard line of his jaw and the shadow of tiredness that still lived under his eyes. I saw the split knuckle that would eventually scar, and the dangerous control he kept over the power vibrating inside him. Then I lifted the mug between us and said, "For now, this is sweet enough." That made him laugh, a low and rough sound that vibrated in my chest, and for a moment, the weight of the mountain felt light. Outside, the snowmelt ticked steadily from the eaves. Inside, the fire snapped in the grate while the ledgers lay open and waiting. His hand settled on my shoulder, warm and steady, not claiming me as a prize, but just being there as a partner. Maybe that was the strangest thing I found in that house. It wasn't the hidden money or the sealed wing or even the old rot men had buried under law and crest and silence for generations. It was this. A pack leader who learned that command could keep a house standing, but only the truth could let anyone actually live in it. A woman who came to count losses and stayed to rebuild what numbers could not hold on their own. And something between us that did not get any simpler once the danger passed. If anything, it got harder, cleaner, and entirely chosen. So if you like your alphas dangerous, your heroines sharp, and your tension living right in that breath-close space before everything changes, subscribe and drop a comment telling me one thing. Would you have stayed for the winter or taken the money and run?